My name is Mike. I'm going to be the host for today. I'm CEO and co-founder of Kosli. I'm so happy that you could all be here today. We've got a really kind of interesting, I hope, agenda for you all. We've got John Willis come all the way from America, who's going to tell us all about his experience in DevOps, DevSecOps, audit, automated governance, and so on. We've also got some speakers from fintechs all over Europe that I'm super excited to share. So, a little bit about the agenda. So, first up, John Willis is going to talk about his latest book, which you should all have a copy of on the desk. It's a book that I'm so happy that it exists. It's something I always hoped would exist. For those of you that are in the DevOps world, you'll know that there's kind of a really influential book called the Phoenix Project, which was the first book that you could really explain to someone who wasn't perhaps very technical why you would care about DevOps in the first place, and what it actually means to do a transformation. It's not just you buy some tools and you put some technologists on the problem and you have a high-functioning organization. It takes much more than that. It's a very human problem. And I've been working in this space around compliance and DevOps and security and change management for a number of years. We started Kosli 3.5 years ago. And I have to say, like for the first 2 years, it felt like we're pushing stones uphill. It was quite a lonely place to be. It was an interesting idea. Most people found it very interesting. But on the other hand, it wasn't really something anyone was doing or talking about. But that's all changed in the last year. All of a sudden, we have a lot of conference talks about supply chain security, around SBOMs, around attestations. And then along with that, we've got Investments Unlimited, which is kind of the Phoenix Project for the work that we care about. So it's really kind of time, it seems to be coming for the story around how do we move forward with like actually achieving DevOps and regulated industries. So John's going to tell us all about the story behind the book, how it came to be, and it's super interesting. I should also say that John is our first employee in America, and we're so happy to have him join the company. He's joining as a distinguished researcher, which we haven't figured out exactly what that means yet, but it sounds good. And I mean, it's really hard though, because the thing is, like, how do you give a job title to someone like John? You know, he has written maybe 11, 12 books in his career. He was employee number 9 at Chef, kind of brought kind of infrastructure as code to the whole world. Was a founder at Socket Plane, a company that was bought by Docker and I believe became kind of Docker Swarm's networking layer.
The guys, my partner wrote all that.
Right. So, I mean, a big part of the whole DevOps movement has been John Willis, actually, and he was the co-author of DevOps Handbook. And it just so happened that we got into a fight in,
we did.
in Washington, D.C., and I'll let John tell that story because it is quite fun. But, you know, the fact that John sees the world the same way we do and really believes in what we're trying to achieve is fantastic, and we're super happy to have him join us. And he's got a lot of good stories that we're going to go through. After the break, we're going to have some coffee and some pastries, and then we'll come back and we're going to get some talks from some of our friends in the industry. So first up, it's Diptesh, who is the CTO at a kind of a social lending platform called Shoal, or social investments platform maybe. But that's not really who Dips is either. He's kind of been a CTO at large for many fintechs over the years. Very, very experienced CTO in the regulated space, and he's going to share some of his experience. We've got Alex Cantor, who's the Director of Technology at Modular, talking about, well, we'll find out, I think, but it's something to do with trolls. And then we've got Espen and Ivan, our friends at Stack from Bergen, come to tell us some stories about their ISO certification. After that, I'll give a brief demo of Kosli, show you what it's all about, how it works, like kind of a very quick rundown of the technology. And then we'll take a break, get some beers, glass of wine, whatever, and then we'll sit down and have a bit of a panel discussion with folks so we can have more space for Q&A. Sound good? Yeah. Great, yeah, great. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to welcome John Willis to the stage. As we give him a round of applause, I'd also like to suggest that one of the things we did at DevOps Days Oslo last month was that every time a speaker takes a drink from a glass of water, it's nice to give them a little clap, just to keep the spirit going. So
got no water.
Yeah, get this man some water.
Heck yeah. Hey, yeah, no, I think the funny story. So I've been working on this idea, for lack of a better term, called DevOps Automated Governance for like 5 years, and I'll go through the story. Really, I could not find a vendor that I thought did what we were sort of driving and building. And I was building this with some of the biggest industry people. I mean, these people that, like, if you had a product, they would have known about it. And I run into Mike at Open Spaces, and I'm saying, I don't think anybody does this. And he goes, we do. I'm like, okay, here we go. Another joker that I'm going to have to beat down. And I'm like, do you do this? And he goes, yeah, we do that. I'm like, all right, do you do this? He's like, I'm like, okay, maybe I better come over to your booth and find out what you're doing. So yeah, that's how so we started with a fight. So he's a good bloke. He didn't hold it against me. All right, so the book, right? The thing is, I'm not like going to sell you the book. What I want to do is tell you the interesting story of why the book became to be, and it really was sort of an industry problem trying to be solved by some people who had this problem. The people who wrote the book, I forgot to do this. I was going to set my timer. Helen Beale did massive work at Lloyd's of London. Bill Bensing did what's something called Dead Sword, what was one of the biggest DoD DevSecOps projects in Department of Defense. Jason Cox runs basically all commercial properties at Disney. John Topopal's first fellow at Capital One. I mean, this is like, I think I calculate 150 years worth of experience in this book. And although it's a fictional story, I mean, they're all basically true stories. Just quickly, I mean, like, I've done a lot of things. I think it's about 12 books, somewhere in that neighborhood of like 10 or 12 startups, most of them disastrous, flaming burnouts, but hopefully that's not the case with Kosli. But I've had a couple of wins, sort of recently. I sold a company to Docker. I sold a company to Dell. In fact, that's when my mother-in-law finally is like, oh, now I get what you do. She could never figure it out until I said sold a company to Dell. So that's DevOps Handbook. The Green Book is the one we're going to really focus in on, which led us to this one. And I've had a 10-year sort of my white whale, if you will, is a Deming book that should be done at the end of this year. So 10 years I've been working on that. So that'll be out there pretty soon. So this is the book. Depending when you hit enter, it could be number 1, number 8, number 10 in some category of the book, The Investments Unlimited. I think it's important to talk about the people that I think are, I mean, there are certainly the 9 authors, but there, for me, Topopal, brilliant, unbelievable, egoless, brilliant person. You go search some of his presentations, a physicist who became a computer person. And me and him around 2017 were just working with Gene Kim, Phoenix Product, and we were just having this conversation about how terrible internal audit and IT risk is and the low efficacy. And one day over a bunch of beers, we said, blockchain, and like, nope, sorry. He came back and reported back when you mentioned blockchain in a large bank, it gets taken away from you back in 2017. So, and then we wrote this paper, and the guy in the middle, John Willis, literally went back after we wrote the book and built a system. And, I became a mentor for that. So these two guys were pretty instrumental in the story that leads up to this novel. And so the other thing is Gene Kim, basically invites about 40 or 50 of us to Portland every year. In the pandemic, it was virtual. And we work on these papers, research papers. We break out into groups. And back in 2015, it is all Creative Commons. They're all out there. There's like 100 papers, not just security. It's everything DevOps, all industry leaders. It's an unbelievable resource. set of resources. But we wrote something, we wanted to sort of discuss the idea of like separation of duties and like that you could redefine the definition of that with DevOps, right? So, and that's a well-told story already, but the one that was really fun in 2018, we did Dear Auditor, and I'll talk a little more about that, but it was sort of a tongue-in-cheek apology letter to the auditors. And then it was about another 10 to 15 pages of actually a risk control matrix, which we really defined. And that led us to this conversation about could we do something like a blockchain-ish way to do the evidence, the attestations, the controls, the gates of the way we deliver software. And that book, then we'll go into, became Investments Unlimited, which was supposedly going to be version 2 of that. So the risk control matrix in Dear Auditor is interesting. You can see real quick, there's like 53 risks, but the 10 categories, and you can see the PAM, the SOD, the SBOM, the DAR. But the one that sort of woke us up, Topo and I, was the number 8, the divergence of audit evidence from developer evidence, right? That was the thing that sort of just stuck out, right? Like that's part of the low efficacy, high toil of what we do in audit in a lot of especially in large banks, but certainly everywhere. And so we sat down and did this green book I've been talking about, which was like, okay, if we're going to do this thing, what's our sort of goal and objective? It is, well, we certainly want to shorten the audit time. Most large banks, most large anythings do 30, 40 days a year, even as we speak today, doing audits. And the audit efficacy is terrible, right? I've gone into CIOs and done spent time doing qualitative analysis for their organization, and how do we do, John? Terrible, and because you look at the subjective nature of the way the audits are and the real data. I mean, we could spend the next hour talking about how terrible that is, and then ultimately, it's a trust model. Why do we have cabs? Because we haven't built the right trust. So these were the 3 primitives that we were going into this thing on. And so we sat down and what started out as a reference architecture, which was, we wanted to increase the efficacy while reducing the toil, with the key of the whole blockchain conversation started this idea that, maybe it's not going to be blockchain, but it's going to be a model that turns an automated model that turns subjective evidence into, subjective into objective evidence. We say subjective attestation into, so throw away the fancy words, but basically a ServiceNow record that says blah, 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 I did this, blah, 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 I did that, here's a screen fit, blah, 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 go look at the log, right? To digitally signed attestations that are immutable and non-tamperable that are completely automated, right? How about that? And so the idea then is, okay, what do we do? Traditionally, we so move from sort of manual gates to continuous checks. We turn 30 to 40-day audits into 0 days. Hit enter and see what the world looks like. We go from checklists to risk controls as code. So the idea is we start building an abstraction layer for our code in that, the idea, what drives me nuts is when I talk to second lines. I was just speaking to a large Asian bank 3 weeks ago, and the guy was telling me he was second line. He used to be first line, now he's second line, 3 lines of defense, right? And he says, this manager came to him and said, why are you looking at code? Why are you always in the weeds? And he said, because I don't trust the second line's data. First line's data, right? So there's just a broken trust model, and so we moved to sort of this idea of a DSL-like function where it's human readable, machine interpretable, and version controlled. So that what we say we want to do is what happens. And here's the real key. Because once we have an abstraction, and we move away from telling second line to look at sneak logs or OPA control or Kubernetes logs, we have this abstraction. So now second line can actually get into designer requirements. And you can agree now on a sort of a construct of these are the things, and they're trusted. If I tell you that there's a trusted perimeter that says it has to be 80% test coverage, the second line doesn't have to go look at a SonarQube log. And by the way, we don't want that to happen, right? And so, and they become self-documented because now the agreement is on the sort of the primitive in the DSL, right? So now we build this level of trust. It's not like, Like, why did I fail the audit? Or why did you do this? Give me the screen print. It's like we agreed that this is the sort of, the construct of the agreement. And again, at that point, we get to arbitrate over whether the construct is correct or not. We don't have to argue about, like, you know, that this is the risk control. I don't understand how to give you that data. And then last but not least is, this is the thing that gets most interesting. Once you build that level of trust through this abstraction, you then actually see, and like this is warms my heart for doing this 40 years now, that's pretty scary, that you start seeing this increase of what are called self-identified risks. So now what you have is developer and operations, instead of being sort of reactive or don't tell auditors that, you know, we don't explain that to them because that's going to add another 5 days. They're actually going back to second line and saying, hey, I think I got another idea that we should probably put into a risk control. They're being creative, because now they understand why we're doing this. So you know you've like really broken down the wall of confusion when that happens. And so in that green book, we tried to sit down and think about what are the stages. So if you think about it, we're going to try to create, you know, immutable data, change subjective to objective. How do we think about the world in terms of like stages where we can build common controls and actors? And so this is just 3 examples, like risk control on computer scanning. Now, some of them might be pass-fail, some of them might be percentage-based, right? So like, for example, if I could put in a DSL that says that, you know, that all dependencies is built for a container must pass. Right? And so now that's pretty straightforward. If today it's Sneak and tomorrow it's Aquasec and it's some other fancy product that doesn't exist yet, doesn't matter. You can plug and play those because the abstraction and agreement between second and first line is already a transaction. And then a risk control is like something like not only that it had TDD coverage and it passed, but maybe it's a percentage. Like we want 70% pass coverage for this particular application. And then, something like it was scanned for secrets. But again, the key is the abstraction, which is the DSL, where we can trust that the source is non-tamperable. So we don't have to have conversations about, well, how did you do that? Well, I used Sneak. Well, how do I know if Sneak did the right thing? Here's the log. I had one second line tell me that the answer in the ServiceNow record was pointed to the code in GitHub. Right? That's not the way we should be doing business. This is a longer list that we tried to address in the book, the first book, the green book, but you can see some of the, but what gets interesting is, remember I talked about self-identified risk? In one of the sort of compliance, like a PSI DSS or even a HIPAA, like cyclomatic complexity might not be a thing that basically is there. But it does make the code stronger, it does create behavior changes, and it really does make you safer. And even like sort of chain size or branching strategy, right? What you find is not only do you sort of, you get self-identified increase, but you start seeing the behavior changes. I had one bank where for years they were trying to convince people to be active in TDD, and once they actually started putting these on a graph in front of everybody, all these teams started raising their hand, hey, can we get that training for test-driven development, right? Container scanning. So we did it for each of the stages. And then, so the idea is, we had original prototype of sort of a YAML-based, but, coming into Kosli, when I saw what Kosli was doing, I was like, okay, good. I don't have to do another startup. I'm 63. I'm getting too old for this game. And it was just a couple of minor missing pieces, and not even missing. They just, but even this week, some of the stuff that we accomplished, John, you want to raise your hand? We started out with the concept, working with the bank of a pure YAML-based DSL, and we're going to get there, I think, pretty quick based on what we even accomplished in 1 week. But being able to just take the Kosli command line interface, we already accomplished basically an Investments Unlimited demo this week, starting on Monday, right? So that's how powerful the product is. But again, human readable, machine interpretable, version control, that's an artifact now. The actual artifact that is this abstraction, this DSL, whatever you want to call it, is part of it is an attestation along with all the other things. So if in a month from now it changes, you know, like the rules change, or, you know, there's a new executive auditor, like we can go back and we can say, well, it was this way when this was deployed, but it was this way when it was deployed. And then, you know, you probably have seen, and Mike will do a great presentation later of, you know, sort of how, you know, and the other thing I liked about Kosli too, which is I've always looked at this as a bottom-up approach, right? Like you know, how, you know, I need to gather all this data in the pipeline and throw it into some, basically a Merkle tree or just some type of non-tamperable data. Oh, 5 minutes, holy crap. I'm sorry. Anyway, Mike will do the rest there. But this is important. This is a place I want to get to really fast with our, what we're doing at Kosli, because this is what we were doing at the bank is, if we have that DCL and we have all those sort of attestation and gates, I want to put this screen in, you know, in Bamboo or Travis or Circle CI or, you know, any of the, so the developer's right there. There's no confusion about when the developer sees a red, they know that they did it with design requirements with the level, the second line, and it takes them right to the DSL or it takes them right to the failure. Anyway, the company, you know, the whole sort of narrative is this small investment company, and they're about to fail an audit, basically. And the CEO gets this sort of notification from, in the US, it's called the OCC, and you know, basically, if they fool around, they'll lose their license. And they get everybody together. And then it's based on the Phoenix Project style, so there's a Socratic dialogue, there's a sort of somebody who sort of helps everybody understand. And I love, one of my favorite lines in the book is, your DevOps has failed you. In other words, DevOps is, a lot of people have done incredible work with DevOps, but they forgot to take security along, right? And then he had to explain to them that they needed to do a lot more work. There's an interesting story around Equifax, maybe I'll do that in the next presentation. But like, here's the org chart. And one of the things we tried to purposely is create a confusing org chart in this fictional company, right? Because, and it's not, the reason I point out I'm going to have to steal a couple minutes, sorry, Mike. The reason I point out the Equifax is a classic example because the CISO reported to chief legal officer. And so when the U.S., you know, so they lost like $5 billion market cap because of a breach, right? And when the U.S. Congress did an investigation on the breach, they interviewed the CISO, and the first question they asked CISO is, when you went to work for Equifax, did you think it was odd that you were reporting to the chief legal officer? She said, yes, but I figured they knew what you're doing. But here's the really scary question. They asked her, when you knew that the PII was breached and the data was breached, why didn't you contact the CIO? And the answer was, they didn't think about it. Well, because that's what happens when you have an org chart. When you have the chief risk compliance officer reporting to the CEO, the CISO reporting, and the CIO reporting to the CEO, you've created 3 silos. And this is not uncommon in most corporations. By definition, you've created a sort of a Conway's law for security, if that makes sense. And so there's Bill, and you know, they get the MRAs. And what was the other interesting thing, too, which was that we made up the story of this company having these, what they call matters requiring attention, which are basically notifications from the OCC that you're doing bad things. You've failed investigations. They had 15, in our store there were 15 of them, and an MRA is like, hey, we're pretty pissed right now. It means you get a matter requiring immediate attention, and so we made this story, and the CEO gets it, and like all hands, the CEO doesn't screw around, but halfway through the book, we found out there's a true story. Exactly, it was Mitsubishi had a North American bank that actually had 15 open MRAs, got an MRA, ignored it, and got a cease and desist, and was not. In the banking business, when you get a cease and desist, you're no longer a bank. So the good news is they go ahead and they figure out how to, you know, hero's journey, they figure out how to fix it. They start small. They pick out like 8 different attestations and gates. This is the demo we built this week. And here's another just fun thing about demos, right? Like demoing 101. So in the book, again, like this is all experience. They do the demo. Everybody's, imagine you're in a room, and we finally get out in the room like, I think we're going to fix this. We're going to do this digitally signed attestation stuff, and everything works. And everybody's like, big deal. So it's like, wait a minute, you got to do a demo where it breaks. You know, so we forced the break, you know, where the checksum failed on an image, and yeah, that's it.
Thanks, John. That was great. we're going to have a little break now. Grab a coffee, get some pastries, relax. We're going to start in 15 minutes. One thing I would like to say is that John is visiting from America, so he has this wonderful thing called jet lag at the moment. So if you do want a signed book, I would get him in this break, or maybe the break after, before he's probably going to hit the hay. Yeah. But either that, maybe you can take a nap in the corner. Oh, and one other thing is that on the back of your badge, there's a little QR code. So in it is a Slido, so you can start to, like, as you get questions, write the questions in, and we'll save them for the panel discussion. There'll be a brief Q&A with John at the end of his next talk. Great. Okay, thanks, everyone.
This presentation, so it was, so if you think back in time, how it was sort of my evolution of trying to get people to change the way they think about what we do in security from a DevOps perspective. The Abraham Wald story, you've probably heard it, you just haven't heard it with his name. So during World War II, there were a bunch of mathematicians and statisticians where their job was to figure out how to do weight distribution and repair of fighter planes that came back with bullet holes. And so this Abraham Wald one day just sort of woke up and said, it's really sort of the definition of survivor bias, which was, wait a minute, we're repairing the planes where the bullet holes are. They're the ones that are coming back. We should be repairing the planes where the bullet holes aren't, because they're the ones that aren't coming back, right? And I think that's a great metaphor for the way we think about, security. Like we sort of look for, maybe we're looking in the wrong place for all the things. And so I asked this meta question. This was about 3 or 4 years ago, which I hope it makes your brain hurt a little bit, but sort of in the Abraham Walding way. What if DevSecOps happened before DevOps? Would the world be different? Because if you think about it, like, again, I'm pro DevSecOps. I think everybody should have a good DevSecOps reference architecture. But basically what happened was we did all this DevOps work, and then we put an overlay of, like, security on it. And that's good, necessary. But maybe did we already have this bias of bullet holes when we were thinking about that? And what if, like, we started with the security? What if some security person said, I got a great way to do security. I'm going to call it DevSecOps. And we started in that order. Like, could things be different? Would we be thinking differently, or have we not thought differently? So Sarah Leitz, who is one of my mentors, she says, and it sounds simple, and she wrote the DevSecOps manifesto. She coined the term. Everyone is responsible for security. And so we were talking at the break about this 3 lines of defense. And so I don't come from an auditor background, all I know is I'd get brought into all these companies, and they would ask, like, hey, John, look at our DevSecOps reference architecture. Like, that's awesome. And, like, you did that. Wow, that was awesome. That was awesome. And then we'd have a conversation. They'd say, we'd by the 3 lines of defense model. And I was like, yeah, that one, not so awesome. Because Andrew Clay Schaefer, like, in the earliest days of DevOps, pre-DevSecOps, made this beautiful caricature of what described the problem of the original DevOps problem statement, which was, he said that there was this wall of confusion. And some of you people that look like you might be close to as old as I am, but there was a day when developers would throw their code over the wall, operations would catch it, and they'd say, it doesn't work. And they'd say, no, you broke it, it works. And, like, this would go on for weeks and weeks and weeks. And Andrew would talk about, like let's just figure out a way to break that wall. Right, and there was some of the original DevOps was these beautiful stories of Dev and Ops working together and collaboration, and, like, you have a whole industry that's been built out of it. So there's busting the wall, and it becomes a metaphor for any non-collaborative groups in an organization. And so I was, when I was thinking about what was the problem statement that drove DevOps, where are we now with the problem statement of what happens in a large organization between first line, second line, and third line? And, the way I view when I have these conversations, second line is by definition a buffer for the third line. Second line has no way to communicate with the first line. This is what Dev and Ops looked like 15 years ago. We didn't have the tools. We didn't even have the cognitive mapping to have those discussions. We didn't even know that we should be having those discussions. So like, and like I said, in the Investors Unlimited, we have a short description about like, how could, I'm not going to go to the Institute of Internal Auditors and say, hey, I'm John Willis, you never heard of me, get rid of 3 lines of defense, right? That ain't happening. But what I am going to say is, just like we do with separation of duties, could we reframe, and we did this a little bit in the book, the conversation of how we think about this. Why can't we create that DSL I talked about where second line can meet first line in design and requirements? And here's the kicker, right? Like, you know, I don't know. I don't claim to be a genius about all things. But what I do know is every bank and every company I've walked in, what's the purpose of that second line? They're basically to make sure they do the job that they need to do. What's the job they need to do? Protect the brand. That's it, right? I mean, like everything falls under protect the brand. Like, and you know, and again, when you're Equifax and you lose 5 billion market cap in a day, or you're another company called Knight Capital that was the second largest high frequency trading company on the NYSE that lost $440 million in 45 minutes and was out of business in 24 hours. Like, that's what they're supposed to do. And our relationship now is to basically hide things from them, you know, like don't tell them, oh my goodness, right? Like that's got to change. And that's why we get into Equifaxes and Knight Capitals and Capital Ones. So what would he do? Like I have this idea that like when I started thinking about security, I'm like if you've ever been to RSA and you go into the exhibition hall in RSA, you're like, I got to get out of here. There's too many lights. There's too many vendors. This is just too confusing. It was almost impossible to come up with a taxonomy for security because there's just so many ways to discuss it and look at it. So I started thinking about like, how do I make it simple? Could I come up with a, and like, I always say, like, until I get punched in the face for saying this, you know, I'll keep saying it, and nobody's punched me in the face yet. So, like a post-cloud native world, or using cloud native as the marker to make the conversation simpler. Now, I'm not implying that, like, security doesn't exist for legacy and mainframes. It certainly does. But we could have a simpler conversation if we just assumed there was a line that we could say everything to the right is cloud native. And so with that, I will tell you that what we need to do and what we do are inconsistent. You know, what we need to do, or what we do is, how do we prove we're safe? Well, we have some form of usually subjective audit, ServiceNow records that tell stories about things that might lead to screen prints. And then how do we demonstrate? We have the poor second line or internal auditors or external auditors try to figure out what all those subjective descriptions are. And we need to do both. So we need to be able to make a system that can prove we're safe and be very consistent to what we demonstrate. Right? And that's the whole point of something like Kosli, or just in general, this idea of, you know, digitally signed immutable data that represents what we say we do. So then the audit isn't a subjective 40-day conversation. It's a 1-second look at this SHA, and we're done. Right? So we move from implicit security models to explicit proof models. We change subjective to objective, and then verifiable. And so back to the cloud native model is, if you can accept that I think there's a world that's right, a post-cloud native world, then I can tell you that I can give you a simple taxonomy for thinking about security and not having to think about it in like 40 horizontal and 50 vertical ways. Right? I did that wrong, but hey, nobody caught it. That's when you should drink water on, is when somebody makes it. Yeah. But I said, and I worked with a couple of groups, and I started hearing from these CISOs, and I said, you know what, I think we can, like, I don't want to call it taxonomy, but we can look at it as risk, defense, and trust, and we can look at it as a transition from subjective, objective to verifiable. So we went through in the last presentation, in 20 minutes, the risk from change to attestation. I didn't talk about continuous verification, but there's really interesting products that are basically trying to use Chaos Monkey-like tools to go beyond just breaking things to actually verify. Like, for example, if this port should never be open, let's just open the port. If this vulnerability should have never gotten through the pipeline, let's launch an application that has that vulnerability, right? So there's some really interesting, called continuous verification. And then, I'll spend a little more on that, but then on defense, it's table stakes to do detect and respond, our SIM, our SOAR, and all that stuff, right? And then everybody's basically trying to build a data lake right now, cyber data lake, right? That's the sort of the in-hip thing to do. And I'm not making fun of it, it's required. But like, there's some real thought process that isn't happening about how do you build a cyber data lake that isn't just a bunch of junk. So there's a couple of vendors and projects are thinking about, like, could we normalize data at ingest, like coming out of the provider? So for example, you take a message that might come from Amazon, the same message might come from Google Cloud and might come from like Oracle, and it might be the same thing, like an increased privileges. But the message is completely different. There's no normalization. And so if you shove that all the way to the right in a cyber data lake, one, you're gonna have a hard time figuring out what even the message is, let alone each one of them has a different meta definition for the ID, all that stuff. And at some point, you really want to attach to that a NIST or a MITRE ATT&CK framework tactic. Like, so let's do all that on the left side. And there's some good work happening there. And then the trust thing is interesting too, because the thing that we're seeing, so if anybody had followed the SDN, so when Mike said I sold the company to Docker, what I actually did is I had this like crazy idea of, could we do software-defined networking in containers? We did it. We literally, me and this guy who was, pretty much invented software-defined networking, we built it, and as this whole idea of how you do trust and build around it, if you think about SDN, right, it was changing a north-south paradigm of how traffic came in and out to east-west. So if you looked at some of the traffic patterns, going back 15, 20 years ago, it was 90% of your traffic was north-south. And then all of a sudden, the more you got into sort of high-scaled service, service mesh, service, all that stuff, it flipped. It went to 80% east-west. And we built network around that. Well, I believe we have to do that for trust now. And we already see evidence of this when we start getting into Kubernetes and clusters and stuff like that. We're seeing sort of like if you've heard of Spiffy and Spire, some of the new service mesh stuff, ambient mesh, I'm throwing out a lot of terms, but there is this possibility to, instead of building this sort of on or off north-south trust, we could create ephemeral trust within a cluster and it goes away. So even things like secrets management, like I think Vault is a great product today, but that stuff could happen really at the mesh level where like a secret just exists in this clustered pod or cluster for the life of the cluster. And by the way, you're in or you're out. Like you're authorized for that cluster. So I think the Spiffy, so I think there's incredibly interesting stuff around what I call, moving, and zero trust is table stakes, right? Like, okay, fine. But like, I'm talking about more of a, let's really go to a level of trust where if the world is gonna be, I don't know if it's Kubernetes, but it's definitely be cluster-based compute. And then then we could build our trust around that model. I know it sounds sort of crazy, but hey. So risk differently, we talked about this, investments unlimited. Oh, this was the Capital One breach, which is fun. Fun for everybody except Capital One, but hey. So basically, this was the stretch to Jakarta, right? This is the stretch to Jakarta. Oh, wait a minute, this might be I'm sorry, this is the Equifax, but that's fine. So what happened was there was a vulnerability in in the stretch 2 library, which almost everybody uses, where if you are on an authorized system, you put a command in, it runs, and if that authorized system, you can do whatever you want. This is what I told you about the breach, but this one's a little more interesting. This is Capital One's breach. So this is like the, like if you follow like aviation disasters, it's like the Air France 447 of computing, if that makes any sense to anybody. So what was interesting about this one is they were basically rolling IDSs. So there was this window of anywhere from like seconds to about 5 minutes where adversary could poke in. There was this woman who was a crypto miner who basically runs 1 billion curls a day, basically looking for one person to put up a proxy with the defaults on. This team that was in a hurry got an exception, put up a proxy that left the defaults, and this one proxy, the default was bypass was on. So this crypto miner got really lucky because the IDS was rolling. They popped through. They hit that IP address is a hardware address that anybody who's ever worked with Amazon Web Service knows is the metadata server. So basically, capital1.com $URL equals the metadata server. And then they happened, because they were in a hurry, they probably cut and paste from Stack Overflow some VPC definitions, and they were privileged. So they got right through, were able to dump the privileges, assume a super user power. Meanwhile, some developer left 100 million business credit card applications in an S3 bucket, right? Swarm through. Here's where it gets really worse. In business card, credit card, like, so the PSI DSS requires social security numbers be tokenized, right? But it doesn't require the corporation ID to be that. And in most sort of, like, I'm sure it's everywhere, but S-Corps, basically half of the S-Corp small businesses, they use their social security number as the corporation ID. So they, so again, there's just all these loopholes that happen, right? And that's called server-side request forgery. I was actually brought into SolarWinds to, one of the authors of the book worked for a Big Four, a Big Five, and they wanted to get the contract of the cleanup job. So I was brought in to talk about, automated governance. Again, like, we can make fun of SolarWinds all day long, but like, every software company out there is basically as bad as they are. So by the way, all your software that you're buying, now that I actually don't work for a software company, we're SaaS-based, we're good. But no, I mean, they're all, you look at what SolarWinds was, and it was terrible. Like, the pipelines, and it was horrendous. And so I go in talking about advanced stuff, and they're like, no, we just got to get DevOps. So they weren't really that interested. But I thought I'd be Johnny on the spot and go in there and take the CrowdStrike MITRE ATT&CK framework and say, all right, I'm going to now really show these guys why they should have used. Because basically what happened was the adversary got into the compiler, Microsoft compiler. This is supply chain attacks. These are the really scary ones, right? Where they're not even going after you. They're going after whoever you're delivering stuff to. So they got into there, and by the way, they apparently they rolled their logs after 18 months, so they don't even know how long they were in there, right? They could have been there for years. And so the CrowdStrike did a really good analysis, and one of the ones that I just caught, in fact, it's in our demo, that's why it's in our demo, was they weren't checking, they were going to have it in the demo, the image SHA, the image SHA. So, so what happened is they sit on MS Build and they start injecting nefarious code into it so that when that product goes out to the Department of Defense or the bank, they've got this open back door out there. And a table stakes sort of attestation would be like, if it's Canadian image or a jar file, is doing a baseline SHA and be able to look before or after and be able to see, like, should have been this, and there's other ways to sort of detect. And the other thing was really interesting, why, like, this idea of automated governance has to have an immutable data store, non-tamperable, is they went in and they obfuscated logs. That's really scary. If they get to live in your company, and by the way, they're in your company right now. Like, don't think they're not there. Now, they may not be finding a way around to do real damage, but you are incredibly naive if you don't think there are adversaries sitting in your corporation. There's polymorphic malware. Like, I could spend extra 20 minutes explaining how polymorphic malware works. They're in your company. The question is how hard it is, or what are the opportunities that arise, the Air France 447s that allow them to sort of get to the next step, and if they're really smart, this is where it gets really scary. They actually can tamper with the logs to remove the evidence that they actually did things. One of the biggest things at Equifax, when that was said and done, I think I got 6 minutes left, so I can tell the story. The Equifax story is really interesting. A lot of people work at Equifax, and so their external auditors are like the thing that drove almost everybody to quit for the next 2 years after the breach was they wanted everybody there to prove the negative. And you know what the negative was? In other words, they were like, you know what? we survived a nightmare because they didn't change the data. That's the scary thing. It's one thing to have an adversary that dumps a bunch of confidential data out in the wild, and that's not good. It's going to hurt the brand. You'll go out of business if they change your system of record data and they publish that your system of the, if you're a bank and I change your accounts and I'm in there for they were in Marriott for 5 years. That breach, 5 years they were in there. So if they're really smart, and this is evidence that they do this. So not only would they might mutate your data, they'll mutate the evidence of the data. That's why it has to be in an immutable, non-tamperable store. Defense differently, again, I talked a little about, you have to think about your side. Don't just build a cyber data lake. There's some really good opportunities to think about how you sort of ingest at the provider level. And there's a couple of providers now building these interesting SDKs that allow you to, I can give you more about it. It's called Automated Cloud Governance. It's out of a group out of New York called ONUG, and where you can basically use these SDKs from basically Microsoft and Oracle and IBM and Google, where you can start building these sort of NIST user data. You can normalize the messages themselves. So by the time you get into the data lake, you're not doing like an incredible amount of compute consumption to try to correlate. And trust differently, zero trust is table stakes, but I think the really interesting stuff becomes, certainly NIST 80207 and the good news is when I first was writing this, Spiffy and Spyro were just external projects. Now they're actually built into the Istio and Envoy and Service Mesh, so they're all there, right? But here's the other thing, and then SigStar is really interesting, Merkle tree-based solution that deserves to be looked at. But since I do have a couple of minutes left, the thing that I'm trying to get Mike and James and everybody really excited about is what's coming down the pike. And here's the thing. In the past, we had this buffer as IT or first-line people to know that the adversaries and the auditors, we are ahead of them. Like we got Kubernetes, they won't figure out what all the dangers, all the ghosts and dragons in Kubernetes until next year, right? Like we've been sort of living that sort of delayed buffer. Well, now what's happening is the people who write the Google stuff, like Service Mesh, Istio, and Envoy, are now writing or getting contract by NIST to write the documentation. So now some of the incredibly dangerous stuff that's in Istio and Envoy, which is the Service Mesh part of Kubernetes, is well documented, English, easily read, and both the adversaries and the auditors can see that there's something called the blue-green deploy that used to only happen at layer 3, or basically what happened now is all the layer 3 stuff can happen at layer 7. And layer 3 stuff was switch config, which was very hard for an adversary to get in your system and tamper with that stuff. But now, an adversary just needs to find one leaky API with the YAML file, and they can basically say, you know what, I'm going to take 1% of all the payment traffic and send it to some latest version. And by the way, I haven't met a company or a bank. I ask people, have you ever heard of the Envoy? Do you even turn on the Envoy access log? What's that? So that means they're banks that are running production, customer payment, or funds-based stuff in Service Mesh, and they have no evidence of how. So this is, for people like Kosli and us who want to get ahead of the curve, a treasure trove. It's stuff that's going to happen so fast, and people aren't even ready. And again, the takeaway is, don't think that, we had the luxury of thinking about the adversaries, I don't think they'll figure that out. It's so advanced. The people who write Envoy, Istio, and that stuff are now writing this documentation on how it works. So the adversaries are not stupid. When you tell them there's something called the blue-green deploy, they might not know what it is, but once they realize it's a reroute of traffic, then they'll know exactly what to do with it. Anyway, that's GPT-3 driven. All I put in is Botch Gloop and John Willis, and that's what I got. And the only thing I will say is, and this is probably worth drinking water, I think the internet thinks I'm a clown. So that's okay.
All right, we've got some time for Q&A at the moment. So I'll bring a couple of chairs up, and we can have a bit of a...
3 cheers.
fireside chat?
Sure. It's okay if I stand?
Yeah, sure. Then I'll sit.
Yeah, all right, that's fine. Yeah. All right, boss. He's my boss, so now he sits, I stand.
All right. Oh, I actually need the questions. So if you have any questions, of course, put them in on the QR code on your lanyard. So before we get into the questions from the audience, I'd like to pick up on what you were saying about the network stuff, because I have to say, when you started talking about this SDO and Envoy, I was like, oh,
why did I hire this guy?
Can we just stick with what we've got for now? Let's see what we've got. And the more I started thinking about it, the more I thought, oh wait, hold on, this is quite interesting, because again, it goes back to the DevOps story, because it's another example of things that used to be in another department in the business, where the developers get so pissed off with it, they decide that, we're going to put this in software now. So first it was, it was build, it's security, it's deployments,
containers came along.
Cloud, it's containers. Like time after time, we talk about everything as code, but it's really developers doing civil disobedience against other parts of the org. In some way. So I'd like to, okay, so networking is one area, but some of the conversations we've had this week are also about data. Maybe you could say a bit about that.
Oh yeah, I mean that's another thing. So one of the things that so the John Willis guy at the PNC implemented this thing, and what was one of the first interesting conversations that happened after, and he built it, and our whole sort of thought process was this is for software supply chain. And it turns out one of the API development teams saw it and said, hey, in fact, they did a pull request, they said, hey, by the way, we've built this system for API development workflow. Oh, that's interesting. Like the decisions, since this isn't really a software-defined workflow, it's a workflow that shows evidence that the decisions you made in defining an API, right? Like leaky API, being able to, all that stuff. And it sort of opened up this idea that this is just a model for workflow evidence. And so I started thinking about what else are we doing, and right at the time, DataOps was starting, this concept of DataOps, right? Moving, like if you think about today, or go back 15, 20 years, let's say 20 years ago, there were a lot of big banks that the way they put software into production was they just put the software into production. And then DevOps came with CI and CD, and then DevOps, it'd be very rare and almost probably pretty close to criminal if that happened in a large bank today, right? There are people that sort of bypass the system, but in general, I don't run into any financial organizations that don't have some form of a pipeline, right? But those same organizations have developers that stuff 145 million business credit cards into an S3 bucket through no operational pattern, right? And so this movement of data ops is, well, could we do a workflow for how we move data? And we've been sort of doing it with data warehouse forever, but now so when a developer wants to get some data, there should be a process of how you sort of tokenize it. Does it get ETL'd? What's the evidence? So when it's sitting in an S3 bucket, so imagine then, before I met Kosli, but now we just had a conversation with somebody that this could be Kosli. So imagine all the way that you're processing this data. You're taking it from the raw data, maybe your ETL process, maybe you're sort of tokenizing, maybe it's going through Kafka and doing this, and it's winding up here. What if you were keeping these Kosli or just this attestational evidence all the way so that when it goes to the S3 bucket, you could reject it, just like you could reject the build, fail a build. Or even better, have a scanner that's scanning all the basically S3 buckets, looking for any data that doesn't have a verifiable meta of evidence. So that's something that, again, the two worlds have to mature and meet together, and I think we're getting, the more the conversations that happen about data ops, the more it puts us in a better, or anybody who's doing this model of that kind of evidence should naturally happen, and it could happen for it. I've seen people talk about it for doing modeling, for example, Monte Carlo modeling, right? What were the decisions that you made, and what's the data that shows? Because when the model runs, it's force de jour, right? I mean, at that point, once it's been trained, it's going to do what it does. Now, if it does really bad stuff, at least I can show evidence that these are the decisions that we made when we were building the model. This gentleman had a question right there. And I know you. You gave a great presentation the other night.
I was just thinking about the information within the data, and what we're kind of the situation that we are in is that the regulations, they keep changing. Everything changes, right? So if we even have this tokenization or verification of the data that you're using, whatever it is in the architecture, if the regulations change, what are you going to do about it?
Well, that's again.
That was what I was thinking, because if you don't scan for it, but if you know where it is, that means that you can go out and you can pick it out. So the GDPR regulations, you could say that, well, okay, we can't keep it for 6 months anymore.
Right.
It's only 3.
And if you get the meta,
Exactly.
the meta will tell you everything.
And then you know where you have what. So you can actually change on the spot.
Beauty, and here's the beauty part of that, too, 'cause it's the same thing with the software delivery, right? Remember I said earlier, the beauty of having that DSL associated as an artifact in the evidence chain is because if the evidence today, if the requirements today are that you had to have this, this, and this, and then in 6 months now there's some executive order or whatever, we realize, oh, you had to have this, this, it's point-in-time evidence. Because the artifact is part of the evidence, so when you're looking at that data or that record, the evidence said you only had to have this. Well, it's even more true with data. With data, it'd be like you might have reclassified. You know, I did some work with Nike. You want to talk about how interesting their data classification is in the cloud. You know, you guys probably don't know who Michael Jordan is because you probably don't follow American basketball, but at the time, the ownership of his data at Nike is cherished as a bank's account data, right? Like the data about some of their big clients that they, so data classification, but then how do you mature the meta around it? And I think that's a great point. Like if the policy changed that it needs to be from 6 months, 3 months, if you have the meta tagged, which this model I think works really well for that, then you could just scan around and say, okay, we got rid of all the data that's been sitting around for in 4 months that were used to be for 6 months, now it should be 3 months.
I think just to add to all of this, I agree with everything that's being said, but like, and you know, we know from the SRE book and from Google and so on that 70% of changes are 70% of system outages are due to changes in a live system. And we focus a lot on changes nowadays in the DevOps world about deployments, but there's so much change that isn't a deployment, right? There's a database migration, or a user is provisioned, or you know, somebody needs to fix up a record in a transaction or something. There's just so much more, but it's the same thing, right? The data currently is siloed, ephemeral, disconnected.
And we talked about this the other day. I mean, what are the basics, and I'll just call it the basic 4, it's probably 5, maybe 6, but what are the basic 4 of audit, right? When the change happened, who did the change, who approved the change, and then usually some variant of, you know, was it successful, was there a backup plan? But like, and that's whether it's data, whether it's software artifact, whether it's configuration. And again, we've got, you know, when the orders come in and ask about like this artifact, which is some library, you know, we still, without something like Kosli, you know, or a solution like that, we spend a lot of time grabbing a lot of stuff to prove it. But when they ask us that same question about database, I can tell you the answer is it's chaos. Because we don't, like, 1, we don't use DataOps as a model, and 2, if we had DataOps, we could actually be more aligned with giving the evidence of like who made, you know, those should be standard 4 in any delivery of any workflow, whether it's an API, whether it's a Monte Carlo modeling, whether it's DataOps, or whether it's software delivery.
100% agree. But in the interest of getting through some of the other questions, we had a question from Axel, which I think is quite interesting. It's like, where do you think the CISO should be put in an organization? And like, both in terms of the formal setup, but like the activities and where they do it from. And it's an interesting question.
So I'll give you, I had a great conversation on the break, so I'll give you my first uneducated answer. And it's not too uneducated. Mark Schwartz, he's another writer for IT Revolution, and he's written a bunch of books, but one of his books is A Seat at the Table. And it's an interesting book that sort of talks about, are you really an IT company if your CIO isn't really on the real seat at the table? And actually, I've done these when I go into large companies, not that I'm talking to CEO. I do actually get to work for CIOs quite often, but not CEOs. I'm not, like, I don't dress well enough for that. But the question, and I like to find out, is where does your CIO sit? Do they sit on the kiddie table or the big grown-up table? Because if they're not on the grown-up table, I don't care how much you try to tell the world that you're a data company or a software company, you're not a software company. So he makes that point really well. And then he says that even like companies that do create this category of a chief, now this might offend some people, but he says that creating a chief data officer is basically an excuse that you're doing it terribly. Because why isn't that part of the CIO? Like, is data not part of information technology? So my only point is, the John Willis answer is, I don't care if you call it CIO or whatever you want to call it, but they all should be aligned. Why is security completely segregated? Like in our fictional, like compliance and risk is over here, the CISO's here, and CIO here. Like, is security not information technology? Now, you had pointed out that there are some requirements where they have to be firewall. But then I go back to, like like John Willis doesn't say get rid of SOD, it doesn't get rid of 3 lines of defense. I say we have to reframe the way we do things. So if I can't change you structurally, I'm sure gonna, like, I'm not gonna get rid of the 3 lines of defense, but I'm gonna ask you until you kick me out of the building, why isn't the second line in designer requirements? You know, every time I talk to you, until you either tell me to get lost or you finally say, okay, they're gonna start showing up, John. So I think that there's somewhere in, like, that's how you solve the problem where it's a hardwired regulation. You work around it by reframing the mindset and the collaboration.
But I think it's quite an interesting concept as well, because I know there's some banks, even in this room, that their second line doesn't report internally; it reports to the board as a kind of like as an independent control function, which makes a lot of sense. But it's interesting that you would take information security as a control function external, than an internal cultural thing that you need to.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of the legacy of our company. Like, not only, so, you know, like I'd say like 5 years into the 10-year DevOps journey, like, oh my goodness, we forgot to bring security along. Well, our industry, you know, talks about like bleeding edge information. Banks say, I want to be, I've seen CTOs of like, you know, Citibank say, we need to be more like Google. In like the 3rd slide, 15 slides later, they have a slide that says do more with less. You know, like, no, that's not how Google does their business. They don't do more with less. They hire incredibly expensive. You take, when a person tries to leave Google for a startup, they basically add about $1 million to their yearly salary. Yeah. You know, so they don't do more with less. You know,
I was really surprised at the IT budget for like places like JP Morgan, and I mean, it's incredible how much money they spend, though. Like, it's more than Google.
Yeah. But again, you know, I mean, like, so a good friend of mine, I can't say who it is, but when you fire up a backup IBM mainframe, you immediately have to write $1 million check to IBM. Right? So, like, and by the way, there are products called NetView and things like that, that the maintenance revenue, there's some, those budgets, there are millions and millions of dollars going to legacy budgets, but yes, the big banks, JP, Goldman is like, I mean, you know, they've been trying to figure out quantum for like trading applications. I mean, they put incredible amount of investment money into bleeding edge tech. I was at Docker, they were literally the first large financial institution that was going all in on figuring out how they could use containers for, you know, basically tier 1 trading applications. So they definitely do spend money.
Great. Okay. So another question from an anonymous source. We have a whistleblower in the room. So how do we overcome skepticism, resistance among non-tech stakeholders who can't imagine life without a cab? I have some opinions.
Yeah, you know, it all goes back to trust. And there's actually a couple of really good books written by Scott Prue, who was part of the sort of the Gene Kim sort of tribe of people. But like there's a methodical way, and it all comes back to you have to create the trust model. And I know it sounds simple, but it could be what we're talking about. It could be, you know, so one of the things I had to take out of the slide deck because it was, you know, I couldn't do it in 20 minutes, but one of the things that got me really interested in working with Topo Pal is back in 2017, they wrote at Capital One. He was the first fellow at Capital One. He wrote a blog article how they did their pipelines. This is 2017. And there's a great article out there, and if you want it, I can get a link to it. It's still very relevant. And he defined what he called 16 gates. And the idea was that they told the developers, if you could show evidence of these, and they're the basic things that you saw on my slide, right? This is back in 2007. They said to developers, if you can basically provide evidence for these 16 things, and we can pick it up, you don't have to go to the cab. Right? So it was that sort of the first model is the way you get rid of the cab is trusted data, right? And there's ways to create trust with non-technical. You know, I heard somebody say recently that like our auditors don't want to hear anything about SHAs or anything. Like, well, then what are they thinking about when they're asking questions about funds? Because that's all, it's all encrypted. And if it's not, they got, again, way worse problems than worrying about what we do. It's how you frame things. Like if you go to a second line and you talk about like SHAs and, crypto and we use Vault to do this, right, you're going to lose them. But if you try to explain it in a way that says the way we protect our system of record data and the data that, like our banking information, is the same model we're using. That reframes that conversation. Well, oh, I get it. Yeah, well, that makes sense. I think that's...
Yeah, I think we've got a question in the audience.
Oh,
was that me?
Did you?
Yeah.
Well, you had the mic.
Yeah, it was just a comment just before you started this whole about the trust model, because I'm thinking that what is important, if you skip the part about the governance coming down and we go back to DevOps, we need to have legitimacy. I mean, I think that the developers that need to have a mandate, or they need to feel a legitimacy to the auditors or the ones controlling them, that they can give away the data, they can give away the code. The 16 gates of trust kind of thing is really important. And I have an example, if you want to hear it.
Yeah, no, I'd love to.
Because I wrote a master's thesis on the security police in Norway, because they had to do a complete reorg after the terror attack that we had the 22nd of July a few years back. My question to them was, how do you trust an organizational change? So what they did was that they asked all the departments' heads, what do you need to work? And they all said more money, more people, and then I'll fix it. And then they fired all of them. Literally, they had to apply for their own jobs. So the solution to all of this was that they asked everybody that worked on the very root level of the organization, what do you need to work? And they said, well, I need to talk to my colleague more. I need to sit in the same room. We need to establish the value chains from the bottom and then up. So they did that, and they did it all internally without any external company auditing them, and it's a completely different matter.
Like, don't even get me started on Dr. Deming, but because we will not end the day. But there's one of probably the greatest 21st century research projects in our industry is called Project Aristotle by Google, and they asked one question. It was, how do you create great teams? And the single answer, although it's a ton of data, they talked to anthropologists, they talked to software, they talked to engineers, they interviewed an incredible wealth to figure out this question. And the answer was psychological safety. And if you think about the umbrella of psychological safety, it includes everything you just talked about. Because if I'm a junior female worker in a corporation that's been around for 30 years that has a bunch of fat old men like me, can that person say, I don't think that's going to work, and not get, you've been here for a week, how would you know? A psychologically safe person would like, we need to take a look at that. So you can't, I'm not saying for you, but it's easy to say we need to collaborate, but you can't have collaboration until you can take into account diversity and all these things that you can break down. And again, some of the best, strongest research that's ever happened in our industry comes out of something Google called, and it just boils down to, and there's some really great resources of people who just track psychological safety. And I think it's the number one, there's two things, I'll get on my meta horse. If make me king for a day of a large CEO, put me in front of a CEO, make a king for a day where they forced to listen to me, and there's two things I would tell them that they have to do systemically in that organization. One is systemically create pervasive psychological safety throughout the whole company, and the second was I'd want them to pervasively create a systemic mindset around systems thinking. Those are the two things I would basically create, and I would tell you everything else will fall into place.
Well, John, you have literally been here for a week. And in the interest of creating some psychological safety, it's time for a break. So we're going to break for 15 minutes, I believe. 10 minutes, I believe.
10 minutes.
So it's, and then we'll come back with some more talks. So see you soon. We're ready to get started again. This is actually going to be quite fun, I think. It's almost like lightning talks. And we've got 3 back-to-back, which are going to be pretty rapid fire. Everyone has promised that they're going to finish on time, but we'll see. It's kind of like it's an experiment. But Debs, if you could come up and take a glass of water, that'll give us a chance to give you a clap.
Thank you.
So I've had the pleasure of knowing Diptesh for a couple of years, since we were originally Compliance DB and then became Merkley, and all through our life to Kosli. Actually, you've gone through some journeys as well in the meantime. I'll let you introduce yourself maybe, but I'm super happy you're here. Thank you.
Mike.
And yeah, take it away.
Thank you.
No.
Right. So I've been in financial services looking at the overlap between regulations and DevSecOps over the last 6 years. It's been an interesting journey, and I've looked at it from the startup lens, both within larger corporate banks, more traditional investment banks and retail banks, but also upcoming startups starting from pre-seed, seed rounds. We built my last role before Shoal was at Crew Bank, where we built a digital bank in the UK from scratch, which is one of the most highly regulated environment. And now I'm at Shoal, where we are building a sustainability marketplace, where we are going to offer financial services products, but with a sustainability angle to it. And it's part of Standard Chartered Bank, so we have all the regulations that we need to comply with. Hopefully, I'll keep it nice and interesting. Let's see how much I succeed. So yeah, so as you can get from the theme, it's based on aliens versus predators. Can I get a quick show of hands if everyone has at least seen one of the movies or the game? Yeah, great, thank you. That really helps. I was worried for a bit. So there's this complex dichotomy between regulations and DevSecOps, and you think, if you have been in a modern financial services organizations, you can't really escape it. It's constantly there, be it whether you're a fintech startup, a scale-up, a traditional or a digital bank, retail, private investment, central banks. Irrespective of what you do, you have got those challenges, and it's about picking a side, right? Before we pick any sides, who you think might come up on top, it's probably worth thinking about what each one of them are and their salient points, right? Regulations, why do people love them? They're very well defined, clearly documented. There's limited scope of interpretation, so you know exactly what you're going to get, what you need to do, right? There's less room for interpretation there. DevSecOps, on the other hand, it's a bird, it's a plane, no, it's an alien, right? Even Superman is an alien, for those who know the full story. So it's one of those where people are still trying to agree on one term for DevSecOps, right? If all of us went into a room and everyone had to write what they thought the definition of DevSecOps was, I'm sure we'll probably have tens of different answers in this room. Who are the main cheerleaders, the fan groups that drive regulations? We've got the regulators themselves, obviously. We've got the people who hold senior management functions or part of the senior management certification regimes, risk and compliance teams. Every single regulated organization has them. The gatekeepers, the change haters, they're known by different names. None of them were given by me. And then you've got DevSecOps. Who are the people, the cheering squad for them? You've got digital and cloud natives. You've got startups, as well as established tech behemoths, like the FANG organizations who are big proponents of it. You've got the disruptors, you've got agile coaches who are coming into organizations and saying, you should have DevSecOps. And of course, you've got tooling companies, not naming anyone, but. At the same time, there are some common themes here. They're not entirely different. Both the regulators and DevSecOps says that it's non-negotiable. You absolutely must have us. For regulations, it's about the license to operate. You've got a mandate from the regulators within your jurisdiction, and you need to be compliant with those regulations to operate. Similarly, on the DevSecOps, it's about being agile, about being able to promote continuous changes quickly and efficiently. Right? So there are some common reasons. They both think it's non-negotiable, but at the same time, it's about making sure that they have different reasons for it. Right? Final part before we kick off the battle, the weapons. What do they bring to the table? Right? So DevSecOps have got agile and digital transformation on their side. They've got innovation. That's the new kid on the block. The most important weapon at their disposal, DevSecOps toolings. Now, please don't strain your eyes trying to understand any or all of it. I'm sure you'll find it online, but the idea is there's a growing plethora of different tools, new ones coming up every day, all of which provide different new features as part of it, right? It's a proper sprawl. Regulations, what are their weapons? You've got forms, more forms, death by forms. It starts with frameworks. You've got policies, controls, and audits. So there are different aspects that you would have all come across in any regulated space. What's their nuclear weapon? You do not have our approval to deploy to production. That one sentence just kills everything. Right? So that's their main weapon. But is it really a fight, right? We have looked at how they are set up. We have seen they're potentially trying to achieve different goals and objectives, but are they really completely opposites? Can we not come to a middle ground somewhere? Let's take a step back and think about where are they coming from, right? What are the drivers? And that's one of the core aspects, like when you get into a conflict resolution mode where you've got different viewpoints, you take a step back and start from the beginning, see where people's viewpoints are coming from. Right? So regulations, they have a duty of care. Starts from a good place. They want to protect the customers. But at the same time, some of it you sometimes wonder, are they doing to protect the system itself? Right? They love inertia. A majority of these issues that you see are caused by deployments or releases. Right? Any changes you make to the system is very likely to have been a cause of a problem. Right? And of course, they want to ensure there are proper processes, governance, and controls. In terms of DevSecOps, they've come from that mindset of being lean, having principles like ability to fail fast, test and learn, continuous rapid change, so almost on an ongoing basis, and lots of automation. Right? Anyone recognize this? Yeah, this is the famous Agile manifesto, and some of it has been lost over the years in translation, where people think that what was meant was only the things on the right are important, right? So while the manifesto itself was very clear that while the things on the left are also important, those on the right are the ones that we would look to do more of. But some of the things, like if you talk about a plan in an agile organization, you'll hear things like, we don't do any plans. There is no need to plan. We are fully agile, right? So that's not what it's meant. Same for documentation, right? We have working software. Our code works, right? But it doesn't say don't document anything. So there is a room for all of the 8 elements on this. And it's about that's kind of where you start looking at what's the common ground. Where do you get regulations, which are kind of represented on this side to work with those from DevSecOps. So now that we understand a bit more about them, perhaps we can negotiate. Right? So to start with, we can look at testing everything, figure out how we test. That can be a whole topic in itself, right? testing, we were just discussing during the break that you can test everything, have 100% code coverage, every single test passing, but actually not test anything useful. So there's a lot to be done in that space. It's about continuously learning in all environments, right? That was another area where if you look at changes that fail, once you get your pipeline and your processes sorted in terms of automation, one common thing that's still different across environments are things like configuration. You will have a very different configuration in your production environment than what you would have in staging. And that might mean because you're connecting to a different backend. It could be because you have a third-party system that has a sandbox and a production environment that's separate. Anyway, any of those will give you differences, and it's about how do you test, work across these environments, and work hard to avoid failing. What people who are on the regulation side do not like is a more loose attitude where people are like, it's okay to fail, but it is okay. Then that's where the psychological safety of the team and understanding of that comes in. But it's not an excuse for taking things lightly or not being diligent about, have you tested everything? Have you thought about possible exception and error scenarios, right? So it's about working through those. And when you do fail, fix it, learn it, and then work harder for next time, right? Continuous everything. So this one, one important part is regulations. People think regulators are have a lot of inertia, or risk and compliance have a lot of inertia to change. But inertia is not just about being addressed. It's also can be about uniform motion. So you can actually move towards a continuous everything pipeline, which enables these to move at pace. And yes, automation of processes, governance, and controls. I think that's the recurring theme that you would see today, at least. So what does it take? You've got fully engaged organizations. You must have buy-in from the leadership all the way to the grassroots levels. You can't do or bring them to the table without one or the other. You need to have empathy and patience. That's a key part of leadership. It enables teams to understand each other, different viewpoints, and it requires a lot of work. Regulations have been built up over decades, sometimes even centuries, right? DevSecOps hasn't had that many years to grow. If we are to work together, empathy and patience are both important from all sides. And having a structured process. Think about what are the requirements? What are we trying to achieve? At the end of it, we are trying to release or deploy code, but that code itself has a purpose. Right? Why is it needed? What happens if it is not there? So every time we come across a control, think about being clear around why is it needed. And an important question is like, okay, if I now remove the control away, what is it that can happen? What are the risks, right? And the third part is from where it starts getting interesting. How can these requirements be achieved, right? That's an open-ended question, but sometimes you might get the standard answer. Fill up this form. By the time you complete this process, you would be well set. But what is it that filling up that form achieves? So the second question comes in. What are the different ways in which this requirement can be achieved? If you ask them of everyone who have a different viewpoint, you'll get different answers. But in the end, you'll be better off because you can understand that there's not just one way, which is a document-driven, Excel spreadsheet-based, or some system where you need to fill up forms. It's where you can bring different thoughts, automation into play as well. Finally would be what would provide assurance on the effectiveness of controls, governance, and processes. That's the most important part from a regulatory standpoint, but that's what we're trying to achieve through automation. Right? So again, you boil it down to what are the outcomes and key results that we are looking for. Right? And once you've got all of these answers, it's just figuring out the next steps. So who was going to do what, by when? How long does it take? It takes forever. It's a continuous process, right? It's the journey. There is no final destination here. It's about making sure the journey is as enjoyable for the alien as well as the predator. Okay, so where do we start? Why not define and start with an MVP? Define the minimum process that you need. pick up one part that you think you can automate, figure out how automated governance can be introduced in that area, and then maybe you can get them both to sit across the table from each other and play a nice game of chess instead. And that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Debs. You want to take an extra glass of water so we can give you another clap? Thank you. Okay, great. This water thing actually works. Okay, next up it's Alex, who also we've been friends with for a little while now. And he has an extra laptop.
Put it on top of yours.
Dueling laptops, it's fun. You'll need this.
Yes.
And I'll leave you to introduce yourself.
Thank you. Very good.
Can we get this man some water?
I've got some water. It's here. It's good. Probably. Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Gunter. I'm a Director of Technology at Modular. Modular are an embedded payment system. We connect to many different payment rails. Today, I'm trying something a little bit different. I'm going to kind of bring to life some of what we talked about, but in the story, kind of a fairy tale, different way, and hoping that all of you get some value out of the end of it, even just a little bit. I'm aware that in this room there's different levels of organizational sizes. Some are kind of behemoths with change managers, others are smaller fintechs. So for the bigger organizations, some of this might sound like a fairy tale, but hopefully there'll be something for you to take away at the end. So to start with, I am going to need a name for the troll in my story, and I'm well aware that in a Nordic country, this could end up very badly for a non-native speaker. So who wants to give me a name for the troll in the story? Someone give a suggestion. Come on, somebody must have a name. Give me a good, strong, local name. Ture? Is that pronounced correctly? Perfect. Okay, so Ture the Troll. Done. We're now going to follow the story about how this troll was misunderstood. So there once was a very mean, grumpy, and evil troll called Ture. Ture lived in the land of Modular, a land where the letter A did exist, but was occasionally dropped for coolness and URL purposes. So now the troll generally hid in an area of a land, I think pronounced auditus. So no kind of signs there. But every now and again, Ture would give notice that he would be wandering around and demanding to see evidence of all of the processes that have been put in place, that everyone was following them, otherwise people may just get eaten. As you can imagine, the good folk of Modular were always very wary of Ture, for no one likes to be eaten, for one, but two, they felt that the mean, grumpy, evil troll, all he wanted to do was slow them down and make them copy and paste evidence from multiple systems into a Word document, which was just forever tedious, boring, and so annoying. It was a nightmare. Sadly, this was the same across many different lands. There were many lands who had their own version of Ture. And what happened is that various rulers left their lands to go to other lands and brought the processes to keep their trolls happy to those lands. And these processes just kept growing and growing, and no one ever questioned why. But they knew it stopped them from being eaten. And that was it. One of the processes that we'll talk about more in the story is the segregation of duty. It has been mentioned many times today. But in Modular land, this meant that the builders passed their finished goods to the deployers. The deployers would then go through and check if the builders had it verified, have they had it tested, have they filled in the right forms, are the forms all okay? The forms will then go up to the higher approvers. The higher approvers will then check everything they need to do. And then after that point, the deployer had filled all the paperwork correctly, and all of it was written down, a long waste of time, and it really slowed down the value from the builders getting to the land where all of the connected kingdom can get value from it. Now, years went by in this land, and this process was continually followed, and that value continued to be delayed. But there was one deployer manager who started asking questions. Why do we need to do this? And Yeah, we'll go with it. The king of technology is my story. Okay, king of technology. Gave him the answer, because otherwise the troll will eat us. Now, the young deployer manager was just like, okay, I'll go with it. I'm not overly happy with that response, but we'll work with it. And a few months went by, and the deployer manager again saw the frustration of his deployees having to just do this menial deployment work instead of improving the land they were living in. And he was like, why? He was just like, is this really necessary? And the king replied, well, yes, because otherwise the troll will eat you. He took it, he was a bit disgruntled, he went away, he explained it to the team. They're like, fine, we'll just get on with this. The king never really stopped to think about it. He just kept on giving the same answer because he'd been beaten into the same answer from all of the lands that he'd been to. Now, as this is a fairy tale, we do need to shoehorn some things in, so go with me on this. Suddenly, there was a salesman that came around from the land of Kosli. Yes, I know yeah, we'll get there, it's coming up later on. And so Modular often had a lot of salesmen, but this salesman, something struck a chord. He actually said, we can give you a warm, fuzzy feeling that makes it possible to see exactly how the builder got his building into the land of Modular. Now, the king loved being warm and fuzzy, because not just because it's -10 outside, but actually, he thought this could make life really easy for gathering evidence for Tore, the evil troll. And obviously, kind of. Well, so it wasn't that bad a story. And that would be a way of stopping him eat his people. So the deployment manager was sent on his way and wanted to connect the land of Kosli to the land of Modular. But then this reminded the deployment manager to yet again ask the question in yet again a slightly different way. He said, you said the troll will eat us, but what value is the troll getting? Except for, what is he doing? What does he want? He's just slowing us down. All the value that I can see is that we know how to deploy it, they don't. Where is the actual value in this whole process? Now, this stopped the king in the tracks. He thought, actually, I've never really sat down and thought about that in that way. We just think to follow the process, to stop being eaten by trolls. So they thought about it. And it's like, sure, it will stop someone malicious acting and putting our code into our land. But if the builders all have controls in place and the controls check that the builder has had another builder check his work and that testing is all done and the testing is to a certain level, then the only value is that it's the ability to deploy. And if we're really honest, do the deployers really know what they're deploying half the time? Or are they just checking the paperwork and making sure it's okay and getting the approval because they've got the access? So there was so much time that could be saved here, and the deployment manager saw an easy way of using Kosli to do this. So they decided to be brave, and they're going to go to the home of Tore, the evil troll, in the land of Auditus. And they arrived there, and Tore opened his big door, and the king said, "Hi, we just want to collaborate." There was a long pause, a really long pause. And Tore started crying. This was really odd. King and the deployment manager looked at each other and this is very strange. And he just kept crying and crying, and he just left the room, but suddenly came back with a tray of open sandwiches and herring. Now, it's always important to connect with your local audience when telling a story, so that's why that was shoehorned in there. Now, eventually, the troll did stop crying, and he was able to speak, and he said, "Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. No one ever asks me how I feel. No one ever asked me to collaborate. No one ever asked me to be part of this. You just give me the processes, I have to check, you keep trying to hide things, I have to kind of then eat you because you're not following things. I just want to be involved," said Tore, "and you've involved me." "Oh," said the king and the deployment manager. "So you actually want to be our friend?" "Yes." "Right. This is a bit embarrassing." "So if we give you a way that you can check, and will you promise not to slow us down?" "Yes." I just want to see that you have some element of control. I don't care. Just show me. Oh. So we fast forward 3 months, and a deployment manager worked with the land of Kosli. And what they actually did was created a single pane view. Tore could see exactly what he needed to see. He saw where the building happened. He saw the magical thing of Shah. And Shah ending up in the production being the same one. And there he was. What also then happened was that automated approvals can happen through the land of Kosli. So the builders could then get their changes through and have the automated approval, which then led to reduced lead time to change, with another mythical element of DORA, which is coming. DORA is coming. We know this. So that reduced lead time to change, all these 3 benefits through the empowerment of the builders. So by integrating the land of Kosli, by speaking with the evil troll Tore, who was just so misunderstood and just wanted to collaborate and be friends, they empowered the builders. What happened on top of that then is that the builders then actually broke down their changes into smaller chunks, and they delivered more frequently. The deployers then spent a lot more time also improving the land of modular to make that deployment process safer for everyone. Now that kind of brings us to the end of this fairy tale, which actually is a true story, can you believe it? And was a brilliant journey that we did go on with Kosli. But some of you, as I said, may find this a bit of a fairy tale and maybe find it a stretch too far with what you've got at the moment. But for me, what came out of it and the lessons that I really took away, the biggest one was how much empowerment are we blocking by hiding behind the process and not challenging the why? So we talk about automating processes, but have we challenged them? Have we really found out the why? Have we simplified them? So you may not be able to get the full stretch, but you can probably challenge a process and just see what's the why. And worst case, if there's nothing else you can do, just go back to your companies and give your troll a hug. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was fun, wasn't it? I do love a good fairy tale. Right, well, next up we've got Espen and Øyvind from Stack, our friends in Bergen. So they're quite unused to this dry and quite arid climate of Oslo, but we're super thankful that they made their way here. I will allow you to introduce yourselves, but please have a glass of water.
All right, can you hear me? Yeah. Hi, I'm Espen, and it's good to see so many people here today. And this is
Øyvind.
And we're going to talk about Stack's journey for doing ISO and our road being Isonauts. So some introductions. My name is Espen. I am the CTO of this Stack group, and Øyvind is head of product development for Stack Flow. Flow is our automation offering for automating business processes in banking and insurance. And
Yeah, so we were both developers and architects.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And we have a combined experience of over 25 years, both as consultants, vendors, and also on the product side. Yeah.
And Stack is a company delivering software for banks and insurance companies, and it was founded in 2016-ish, and but its roots go back to the 90s. So it was founded by a team that had a lot of experience in developing software for the banking industry. And it has grown relatively rapidly from a very small team of 10 people in 2016 to almost 200 today. So it's been quite a journey for our company.
Yeah, and in growing to that size, we chose earlier this year, I think it was March, to finally get ISO 9001 and 27001 certified. And we made a pretty ambitious attempt. We would do it within the year, or in about 9 months. Yeah.
Yeah, I just heard from our CEO that he thought that there was no way we're going to do that.
Yeah.
It's completely impossible.
Yeah. Yeah, next slide.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, while wanting to, so this whole theme of this conference has been like, okay, there are these trolls that we want to avoid, right? Brilliant way to phrase it, by the way. So we came from a world where we already had a pretty well-defined automated DevOps process, even some secure in there, even. And what my main worry, and Espen's main worry about this was, okay, so we're getting ISO. Does that mean that we have to introduce like change advisory boards and fill out a lot of forms? And oh my God, this is going to hurt so much. Yeah, that was kind of in the back of our minds when we started thinking about this. But at the same time, we knew that we didn't really have a choice, because we were delivering software to like big banks and also a lot of regulated players, and there was no way we could avoid basically having proving that the way that we were delivering software was kind of secure, and that we could prove that it was secure.
Yeah, so as mentioned, Stack is a group that comprises 8 companies, if you count the group, and it has a variety of history in each of those, because of our strategy to grow through organic growth, but also through mergers and acquisitions. So you can imagine buying new companies would involve also taking on their legacy and their code, and we had to see the constellation and find solutions that could work for each of those as we moved forward with existing processes. Yeah.
Yeah. So in addition to like different companies or different departments that they know where, with different processes, there was also great variety when it came to tooling. And we didn't think of this as a bad thing, right? I think it's really important to be flexible when you're working in like an area like this, and different teams should be able to kind of pick their own tools. So in order to kind of achieve this this automated compliance thing, we needed a solution that was really flexible when it came to how you could use it.
Yeah, so that's where Kosli comes in for Stack. We had met Mike and James previously throughout the years when they were named Compliance DB and even Merkley, and it kind of fit perfectly into our needs matrix, because we had to have a tool that could again go into each of the build automation pipeline tools and work across each of the development teams we had in-house, and it just fit perfectly. And the flexibility of it also in providing the evidence and the gathering it was just a perfect match for us.
Yeah. So we started out, like we mentioned this, so for those of you who are into astronomy, this doesn't really work, but our designer created it, so I guess it's fine for now. But as we mentioned, we were in for quite a journey, because again, going from nothing to ISO in 12 months, that's quite something. So basically what we started on was creating a proof of concept, because we need to make sure that all of the requirements from our internal risk people were filled, and it would work actually in our existing pipelines. So we created a proof of concept together with Kosli, and that was a success. We presented it to our board and or to our management group and got approval to go ahead. So next step was basically, okay, how do we industrialize this? Because we have, I don't know, 500 different repos with their own pipelines. So we needed to do some kind of stuff to make it reusable. So we created a couple of pipeline templates, and then we started piloting them across several teams in the organization, gathered feedback, and basically started working on that. Right now we're currently rolling this out company-wide.
Yeah, so end of November, last 2 weeks was audit time. So the audit, we just came from there. No, we didn't. We had a week's rest now, so we're past it. But the thing we're talking about, of course, is the change management part of the ISO, and we passed with flying colors, and I have to give a nod back to the other all of the other people working on this certification, which they had much more to do. We had all the right tools, right? So we even got a quote from the auditor going out the door. This is going to make me unemployed, of course. This was in relation to change management, of course, and what we could provide as evidence along the way.
Yeah. Yeah. So, well, the certification is not yet on the wall, but it's basically at the point where we made a place for it, because we think that it's actually going to get up there in the time frame that we anticipated, or hoped for. No, anticipates.
Yeah.
And and again, like, I don't think many people in the company thought that we would basically be able to do that. Yeah, and for me, the change management process, of course, was what I was worried about, because as a developer, that's basically where it hits you the most.
Yeah, and the book John was part of writing kind of helped as well with the communication and talking. Even with the troll story is succinct in that we need to bridge the gaps between management and development and get it as a team effort and not as a siloed thing, right? I know a few of our coworkers are looking, but we actually bought this as this is going to be in the Christmas gift for all in Stack, and it's really been a helpful book in the latter parts of the ISO certification. We're still not there. Again, full-scale rollouts inevitably going to have some challenges, and again the constellation of each of the companies and the diversity in tech stacks and build tools, we have a way to go, but it's looking good, and Kosli really helped smooth that out. So thanks, Kosli.
Yeah, and thank you for inviting us. That was really nice of you. And if anyone wants to talk to us either about compliance or Stack, then feel free to do so afterwards. We'll stick around for the rest of the day. Thank you.
Oh, that was very kind. Thanks, guys. Okay, so I'm between you and pizza and beers, I think. Oh, no, just beers. We get pizza afterwards. But anyway, it's an uncomfortable spot to be in. I'll try and make it a little bit pain-free. But what I wanted to do is just to spend maybe 10, 15 minutes to give you a brief, kind of introduction to Kosli. I want to actually show you the product, because I think that's the most important part. We've done a lot of talking, but I'll go through just a few slides quickly to get some orientation. Yeah, so kind of what's interesting is what's happened in software over the last 20 years. Well, since I joined the industry, when we started, it was big iron, probably in the basement, run by an IT department, very slow changing, very kind of monolithic, systems, very siloed organizations. And then kind of as we kind of coming through the world, we started to get to more kind of rack-based infrastructure, moving towards the cloud, microservices, functions as a service, Lambda. We've gone through this kind of whole journey, and we've got some customers that are really young fintechs, and they started, and they just go dive right into the right-hand side of this, which is great. But we've also got other customers where it's right across this whole, like for them, IT is this whole picture, and lots of it, right? You've got kind of all kinds of things from mainframes to WebSphere to all the way to the cloud. And what's interesting is even if you start over here on the right, you still have the same problem. In fact, you have the problem even more so because what you have is a lot more change to deal with. And if change is your bottleneck, that's the problem. So the auditors are going to ask kind of like whether it's first line, second line, third line, they all have the same question. And to be fair, they're pretty fair questions to ask. Like, do you even know what software you're running? Can you show me how it got there, how it's been qualified? It's nothing too challenging to figure out, but the problem is it's often quite hard to find the answer to these questions when you have to go look for it. And what that ends up doing to development teams in regulated infrastructure, like Ivan and Espen were saying, is like, you tend to create a lot of these things, inherited ITIL processes, essentially, that was how we did change management when we had a mainframe. These things are fine, but they have real-world consequences. So if you have a change advisory board, it's really hard to talk about empowering your teams, because you're basically taking their delivery life cycle out of them. They don't get to own end-to-end their process. And of course, like a lot of the other things are like delays and paperwork and so on, which really affect your company culture. And like I was listening to a podcast on my way here today, and it was from someone who's in charge of training people that are entering the US Air Force. It was super interesting. And he said the #1 strategic risk the Air Force has is recruitment and retention. I was like, that's kind of interesting. It's like one of their biggest costs is recruiting. Anytime they hire someone, it costs $100,000. So you want to, these are really important things. And again, if you're in a regulated industry, you're in a war for talent in your technology team. So you have to find ways around this. The other thing is that I think that we've all seen some of the same solutions as well. You have a place where you've got change advisory boards, approvals, release documents, and so on. There are other ways. People make emergency fixes. They don't actually start to put their systems into a proper process until it's ready for live, which is, you're missing an awful lot of your risk if the first blip on the radar is when it's about to land. There's a lot of issues with this. So I'm not going to talk too much about this, but like I said at the very beginning of this day, what I'm super happy about is we started this journey years ago in the company, talking about immutable attestations, controls as code, compliance, and all of these things. And now it's kind of crossed over into the mainstream. I mean, Investments Unlimited is fantastic, and John's got more books up his sleeve, as always. But there's another book coming out next year from IT Revolution as well, which I'm super excited to see is from the audit side. And it's all about kind of how do you get beyond agility? What does it mean to be an agile auditor? How do you get second line that actually is effective as a risk control mechanism, but also empowering the organization? And then, when we think back to the slide with all the different types of systems, in the end, what we're trying to do is go from a waterfall world to a world of continuous compliance. Because what that means is that the change management no longer is your bottleneck. You can release on demand, and you can have smaller, more frequent changes. One thing I'd like to sell as well from the stage a little bit is we have created an open source DevOps control framework, which is a lot of our customers, especially those new to the regulated framework, regulated markets, or they're going towards an ISO or a SOC 2 compliance certification, these kind of things, They know they want DevOps, they've already got DevOps, but they don't know how to write a process that the auditors would be happy with. So we created one, because we've been helping companies through this for years. This is available online. It's a GitHub repo. You can clone it, change the logo, delete the pages you don't like, add pages you want. But it's a very simple way, because like in the end, what you need for any, whether it's your medical, financially regulated, SOC 2, ISO, you need to have a process. You need to actually follow the process, and then you need the proof that you follow the process when the auditors come. So this is kind of an interesting first step. So if you're looking for something like this, you can have a look. We do accept pull requests. Okay, so what is Kosli? Well, basically it's a tool to record everything that's happening in your DevOps after the commit, connect it all together. So these systems that are often very separated, your version control, your build, your test, your security scans, what's going on in your deployments and production, and then make it completely searchable, give you a live map for everything. So the things we've heard from our customers is that often there's a lot of tool sprawl. As software grows, as team grows, you've got different pipelines, often lots of different repos, different CI systems perhaps. You've got no record of how systems actually change. Even if you're doing GitOps, you don't really know when your systems are changing. You know when the definitions are changing, but how those get applied and what happens on the automation side is kind of difficult to figure out. Often, again, if I want to beat up on DevOps a little bit, the dev and the ops worlds, despite all this talk of DevOps for these years, they tend to be in different tools. Right? The developers are in GitHub. They've got pull requests. They've got their GitHub actions. They've got, everything's there for them. But what are the IT people doing? Well, they've got Datadog, and they've got Argo CD, and they've got Grafana, and they've got their own world. And guess what? They just call themselves a platform team. But it's ops and dev all over again, right? And then the developers don't really know where their code is, like which feature is in which environment. Is this feature live yet? Did I break production? They're all good questions. And these things have got impact. Of course, there's kind of guesswork, frustration around incident response. You don't know what's happening across teams. The audit people don't know who to talk to about a system. You have a vertical bar in your monitoring stack. The SREs get involved. Which development team do they talk to? These are hard questions in a lot of places. And then, you know, the bit that we're obviously very interested in is the uncertainty around audit and compliance. Do we really have control over everything? Do we really have documentation? Is there anything running in production we don't know about? It's a bit messy. So this is Kosli. I'm going to jump out and actually just show you it because it's a bit more fun. So is that big enough in the back? Yeah. Okay. So what is it essentially is kind of a bit different than even what's in Investments Unlimited, because we start with the end in mind, which is what's in prod. Like whatever else happens, you want to, like from a change management perspective, you need to know what's running at any given time. So the way we do it is we track environments inside Kosli. You can ship us information about what's running, and we kind of take the cryptographic shards of everything that's running. If it's a Kubernetes cluster, it's an ECS cluster, it's a Lambda, it's a raw server. Like for some of our customers, a deployment is Ansible logging into an IIS server, untarring a zip file into a directory. I mean, that's fine. Whatever it is, we'll figure out a way to track it. And here we can see for this environment, it's an ECS production namespace for CyberDojo. We have a lot of services running. So this is what's in production. Let's dig in a little bit. Creator seems to be the last thing that changed. So, okay, what is this thing? It's a service running. It has this SHA. It came from this Git commit. I can have a look at this. There's probably something. Okay, some pipeline changes and a little bit of HTML. I can see that this artifact or commit is currently running in both the production namespace and the beta namespace. And I can see the evidence that's attested. So this is kind of where we get back to the automated governance, where you say your process has attestation. So I say, I have artifact binary provenance. For everything that's running, I know exactly what git commit came from, where the build log is. You can add anything on top of that, like the SBOM. You can add test results, pull request information, and kind of just assert all of this stuff automatically. And that's quite interesting. If we go back to the environment, then once we have this story, we had another customer who was audited a few weeks ago, and they asked us, can you tell us, the auditor was asked, can you give us a list of all the changes to production in last year? And they had 80 microservices, and before they had Kosli, they would have to go around and look in all the different repos, the different pipelines, and see what was running and which branch was in which environment and so on. It was very manual. So their first audit took 3 months. What's quite interesting is that now it was a 3-day event for them. There was a lot of things that weren't in Kosli that had that required more kind of investigation by the auditors, but at least for like 90% of their landscape, they have a complete answer and they can just export it. The auditors wanted it as an Excel spreadsheet, and we're like, well, it's in Kosli. Like, yeah, but can we have it as? Yeah, okay. So let's make it an Excel spreadsheet. So say okay. Download it as a CSV, and then you can have a complete record of every single change to this environment. Not a list of what you think changed or what's in tickets and ServiceNow, but actual changes to that system. Oh yeah, I never even thought about that. Do I have a spreadsheet program? So you can see, okay, we've got all this information and the SHAs, and the auditors can feel like there's at least some comfort about this, which is great. So, I mean, there's a lot of audit and compliance features. You've got the automated governance, and you've got a complete change history for how your systems change over time. And it's quite easy to set up because for each environment, you just set up a reporter that ships us information, and if there's a change, we make a new snapshot. So it's kind of like version control. What's really powerful as well is that, okay, this is a compliance database, but it's also quite useful for developer feedback. I don't have the client installed, but I can show you a little bit what that looks like. So all the information that we have available in the command line too. So as I was showing you this kind of view in the website, which is what's in prod, well, we can see that at the command line too. So if you just want to say, okay, for this commit, where is it at? Was there an artifact produced? Is there a Docker image associated with it? Is it currently running anywhere? We have commands for all of these questions in the command line as well. Now we're going to bring it to Slack, so you can start to get a daily digest of changes. You can get notified on certain services if you care about a downstream service changing, all these kind of things. All right, how am I doing for time? Oh, okay, but then let's keep talking. No, I'm just kidding. I think now is a good time to grab a drink, and we're going to take a 10, 15-minute break, and then we'll get back up on stage for a Q&A with the speakers from today. So thanks a lot. We are joined on stage. We're lucky and very happy that Lamisi could join us. I think Lamisi might be the most busy person I've ever met. And that's because, if you want something done, you give it to the most busy person in the room. Yeah. So unfortunately, she is busy, but very happy that you could come today. Lamisi joins us from DNB, where you are running the engineering performance group. Productivity, I was so close. But maybe you want to say a few words about yourself and what you're doing at DNB and how that's going.
Yeah, thank you for having me and inviting me to this session. Super excited to learn more or hear more about the stories that have been presented so far. And correctly, as I said, my name is Lamisi, and I'm the head of engineering productivity in DNB. And the main responsible for the DevOps tool sets on the various platforms, also the IT responsible and owner of the SDLC process. So, yeah, pleasure to be here.
So just on that subject, I mentioned the DevOps control framework during during my session, but I'm getting curious about, you know, when you well, tell the story of your SDLC, where it started, how it's going. You have an awful lot of things going on at DNB. How is it one? Is it multiple? Is it a la carte? Is it a fixed menu? What's going on there?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of things. I think it's worth bringing in the context. I joined this particular unit as the service owner approximately 2 years ago. And one of the important or key changes that DNB did at the time was changing delivery models. Up until 2019, it was primarily project-based. And it was pivoted into more stable teams, autonomous teams, DevOps model. And one of the first things that we needed to look at was the compliance documentation and how do we describe the things that we do and how do we deliver software. So primarily it was based on a typical kind of PMP project-based way where 50 different roles, bunch of handovers and approvals and those kind of things. So those were one of the things that needed to change. And it was also, you know, the sort of philosophy and mindset around DevOps. How do we actually want our engineering teams to change the way they're working? How can we sort of inform and enlighten them on how you should sort of, what does your everyday look like compared to from being a strict developer, throwing the software over to some testers throwing it over to someone else, et cetera, et cetera. So there are many, I would say, stakes or many angles that this needs to be looked at when it comes to the culture, the mindset, and understanding what it means to own software end to end. So trying to sort of map that also, you know, with the cultural needs of the organization, but also looking into the compliance bit. What do we actually need to comply with? And where and how do we describe that? So super grateful for the conversation and the workshop that I invited Mike and James through Merkley DB and later Kosli to sort of have a lot of those conversations, the mindsets, the thinking, and how do we actually try to make a difference in an incumbent bank that has been around for a long time with a lot of history, and sort of improve the world of the engineers. If you take the engineering perspective, how should the world look like, and how can we help the engineers to perform? So the work is obviously ongoing. That is not something that is changed overnight. At the same time, I'm responsible for the tool sets. So how do we really bridge that gap from the legal requirements, the external, the internal requirements, and how do we look that into the tools that we're using? Trying to let the tools drive a lot of this, and yeah, it's ongoing.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I just want to remind folks that we do have the Slido still open, so if you have any questions for the panel, please go ahead and submit them there. I'll be keeping half an eye on what's going on here. I'm just kind of, we had a question earlier in the day, which was about the continued existence of a CAB in a multi-vendor environment. I think that's quite an interesting question. Maybe, Deps, you've got a lot of experience dealing with vendors. How does CAB and change management work when you kind of got third parties delivering parts of your system? You've got outsourced partners that are helping develop your product. Again, it goes back to the trust a little bit, but also like the bridging, and what does that look like?
Yeah, typically what I've seen is where you have got multi-vendor environments, you have a centralized CAB, right? So at the end of the day, you look at different changes coming together and potentially going out within a very small window. It's very hard to track down and identify if something breaks maybe a few days after a release, who was the actual party responsible. It's quite complex because if you have an architecture where different teams are working together, it's quite often that two different teams might actually end up changing the same code, right? So I think as CABs, as a concept, I would actually pare it down and look at what is it trying to achieve. It's trying to achieve the fact that everyone has visibility of change, right? Management have an accountability to stakeholders, investors, everyone in the board, to make sure that whatever goes out is representative of the brand, works for the customers, delivers the value that the business want. So, and towards that end, CAB has a very important role that it's looking to play in making sure all the changes have gone through the right testing, so it's verifiable and manage that process well. And then at the same time, it's also about coordinating across different teams and functions.
So, but how has that evolved over time, the coordination problem? That doesn't go away, even if you go to DevOps, you eliminate the CAB. What does that get replaced with?
So I think what I'm seeing more of are organizations moving towards still having a lightweight CAB, which looks at a prepared report, and that kind of has a red, amber, green model, where you look at green are like all tests, everything has gone through, has been verified, yeah, tick done, go out. Right. Red is like something has failed, send it back, no further discussion required. Right. It's the amber, and as organizations mature, the amber part of the band gets smaller and smaller, right? So that's where you need a further discussion. Somebody needs to look into specific areas, and you can't potentially come up with something that works 100% of the time. But organizations are getting more and more better at identifying these and figuring out what to do in these instances.
Oh, interesting.
Just to build on what Dips is saying there's different ways of looking at it as well in terms of what you're fed up into. You can look at it as a job role, or you can look at it as a responsibility that you need to actually carry out during the life cycle of your change. So we started out by having kind of, every 2 weeks having people come together, approve the release, that's what's going on. But more and more, we factor in what John was talking about in his bottom right, which is that distributed trust. So is it how can you actually align and make sure people understand the why, what are you trying to achieve? And then for each individual change, the people that own it, responsible for it, have that distributed trust. Because a CAB, it's, what is it trying to achieve? It's making sure that changes are safe, it's been through the right processes, the things are tested. It doesn't mean that there's a group of people that have to do it. It could be distributed sets of people or just spun up as and when you need it, much like an easy container in terms of how that needs to work. It's the different ways you can think about doing it, but ensuring that you can demonstrate that you've got the controls of what it was there for is an interesting way of looking at it going forward.
Yeah, and I think that's quite interesting. I remember having very similar conversations like 5 years ago with different people about code review and pull requests. So a lot of, in regulated environments, often there's no real getting around like having code review. You need to have, it's the only way to mitigate insider threats when it comes to actual behavior changes to your systems. That's fine, but not everyone's in a regulated environment, but they still believe that the only way to share knowledge and to keep eyes on the code is to do pull requests. Whereas a lot of this stuff can be asynchronous. It can be checked afterwards. Like, it doesn't have to be a block in the value stream, as long as you have a process that you pick it up afterwards or however. So it's kind of, I'm a big fan of like this trust but verify wherever you can do it. Like, there's a lot of systems that don't need CAB. There's a lot of systems that are quite independent and have low risk changes and so on. As long as you've got good eyes on it and that you periodically verify that everyone's doing what they should do. But I mean, I know that's not the case maybe when you're creating like code that changes transactions or payments or anything like this, but there's a lot of systems that are not like that.
Why not?
Well, it's a good question. I think that would be a question for the auditors in the audience.
Yeah.
But I mean, like peer review, like for me, the reason why peer review or 4 eyes or however you want to say it is essential as a synchronous process when you're dealing with transaction data, is that even if it's just a mistake, but say it's a bad actor, a mistake, either of these things can change the behavior of where money goes. And like a great way to mitigate that is, make sure someone else sees it. Like then someone else has at least had like some kind of verification on it. Now, the way we do software development in our company is we do ensemble programming. So it's almost never that people work on their own in our system. So like for us, like I think it'd be better to be able to sign the commit from 2 people and push it and not have any review process. If you could do that, like why not just pair? Then there's no block, the knowledge sharing happens, and at least if there is insider actors behaving badly, then, well, they have to be collaborating as well when you've got a bigger problem.
I just want to add to some of the points there when it comes to the CAB, and I think an important discussion also to have in addition to the why, is also the how. Is it really effectful? Because if your CAB looks like a round table of people who are not really that well versed in technology, if it ends up being checking the form or Excel spreadsheets, has the team ticked off the right buttons? Do we really have the control or understanding of the inside of what the change is actually affecting? And then, what is the purpose of the CAB if, is a CAB meeting, the board is overwhelmed with 100 new changes and quickly has to go through Excel spreadsheets just to mark that, yes, it's ticked off in the right boxes, but doesn't really solve the actual intent and the problem space, which we believe that the CAB was there to help prevent to begin with.
We did have a question from the audience, another anonymous troll, directed towards Stack, and the question was, what set you on your ISO journey in the first place? Why did you decide to? It sounds like, I mean, to somebody not in the space, it sounds like a lot of effort.
Yeah, I actually had it in my notes, but I skipped that part. But we don't really have to do the ISO, but we came to a part of our we came to size and customers who started to call were at a certain size, and it was a way for us to kind of build trust, and also it helps a lot in RFPs and stuff. There's a whole lot of stress surrounding that.
We have to do it anyway, right? Yeah. So one of the reasons that I think it's a good thing for us to get an ISO is that every time we, as Espen said, get an RFP, we have to answer like a lot of questions. And if we don't say, yes, we have an ISO 27001, then we have to fill out a lot more.
Yeah.
So it's just like you do it once, it's painful, but you get through it, and then you can say yes to 250,000 questions at once.
Yeah, and retroactively, it kind of was an exercise in tightening some of our processes. We did make a higher level change management process that each of the companies and teams had to adhere to, but they have their own processes and adhere to that in different ways. But yeah, it kind of forced us into being delivering even better quality across the board.
Yeah, I think that's one of the interesting things. I see it. I mean, I see a lot of companies in your space as well, like go through this process and like there's no such thing as a crisis. It's just like, the end of an illusion. So like when teams are told, oh, we're management or someone has decided we're going to do this thing, and it's like, oh, and then you read the standard and you think, oh my goodness, this is, and then you say, can we even do this in a year? And you think, what else? I'm supposed to, this isn't my job, right? ISO 27001 isn't why I was hired. I've actually got product to deliver.
Yeah.
But then, like, as you go through the process, you think, okay, well, actually, this is improving our ways. Like, okay, we've got structure now. We know why we're doing things. And, okay, there's some growing pains, but I guess the developers now don't really notice much difference, right?
No, not at all.
And actually, we were doing most of this already. We just weren't documenting it. That's the big difference between before and after.
We couldn't prove it. We thought we were doing good, but we couldn't like prove it in an audit type of situation, right? So that kind of forced us into thinking a bit different, and also kind of standardizing some things across. And again, Kosli was one of the key things that is going to be company-wide, although the processes are a bit different and tooling is different, yeah.
And let me see, at DNB, you've had, well, you're going on a journey as well. I mean, I guess you're seeing some unexpected, like, you go through this kind of, you go through the expectations, the trough of disillusion, and then some of these things plateau over time. I mean, how is it, where are you on the hype cycle for the journey?
Well, when you're all enthusiastic and they're going in, saying you have your vision that, yes, we're going there, right? And you now start to face some of probably the uphill battles, or not everybody's buying into the vision, or maybe potentially also failed into explaining some of the details properly so that people could see what you were seeing and those kind of things. And I think, that is I believe the textbook model of any transformation is really and truly a form of uphill kind of battle, trying to convince the right people that this probably is a better way of doing things. But at the same time, the organization is open to learning, but at the same time, you're battling this, are we all looking at the same vision here? And one of the things that we're doing is trying to demonstrate value rather than trying to convince everybody in a meeting and having everybody, giving a thumbs up around certain things. Through this here from DNB as well, where we, looking for those teams, or let's say the innovators, if you follow the classical curve of, who are sort of interested and open to experiment, trying to demonstrate value locally, and then showing that, this is a better way, or this is potentially another way of solving a particular problem. So, we started off drafting of a new SDLC, trying to incorporate some of the DevOps principles and those kind of things. But we are a huge bank, and we have everything from the mainframe to the cloud, 2 different clouds. We're everywhere. We have every technology running in the bank, literally. So, it's a huge undertaking, trying to transform the entire bank at the same time. So you had to be realistic that, no, you can't probably do that. And some people are probably not willing either to change, because this is how I've been doing it for the past 30 years. This is what I know. And I'm not really, looking to change. I'm comfortable here. Yeah. So, there are all kind of dynamics, but we're trying, there's an exercise between, being compliant according to the legal aspect of things, and the drive also to mature the organization, if you will, around certain principles. So trying to find that happy medium where you are able to at least comply on a bare minimum, I would say, that everybody can, while on the, let's say, through maybe other means, trying to mature and advance the thinking in the organization. So I haven't found the perfect recipe yet, but I'm recognizing that this is a part of the journey. So, yep.
It's funny, I'm reminded when you say that story, so before starting this company, I worked as a DevOps consultant, and the consulting engagement that really got me convinced that this was something to do was I was asked to come by a CTO at a bank in Australia to come down and help them with their kind of DevOps transformation. They were building an engineering practices team. They got the best architects and technologists from within the company, and they formed them into like a consulting team almost that would go in and help kind of bring these teams with them into like the future they wanted. So I was going in to train them how to do things like, value stream mapping, set up a process, get a branching strategy in place, figure out how to automate your deployment, all that stuff. So I mapped it all out. They went from 6-month releases to 6-week releases by the time I'd got there. But, at their 6-week kind of release cadence, half of that was release. It was like cutting a branch, getting a slot in the change advisory board, which needed 10 days advance notice to show up to. You need to fill out their long SharePoint form, which had information you already had in all your other DevOps systems. You went there, and then I sat in one of the cabs. It was fascinating. Like, it was like a big cab. There was 4 people in the IT change board. That was their full-time job in the bank, was to sit and run this process. And then every program lead would come in and say, please, can I make my change? And then afterwards, I spoke to the IT change manager, the head of the group, and he said, yeah, so, I mean, we're here basically to make sure that everyone talks to each other. And I was like, that's not what happened. Everybody spoke to the cab and said, please, can I make my change? And then they went home. I was like, okay, this is, the cab doesn't know anything about your software. And then, okay, you get your check off from the cab, and then you put something in the change calendar, which was another new thing I'd never heard of. Like, okay, in a week, we're going to deploy this, and we're going to bring developers, testers. We're going to have a network engineer who can change the F5 configuration. It was incredible. I was like, okay, this is definitely something to do there. That same CTO that brought me into that gig, I had a chat with him this morning. He's now a CTO at another bank in the Middle East. And he said, it's amazing. You know, what took us 10 years to start adopting the cloud and so on, we've done in a year at this bank, just because, you know, the world has moved on. And what's changed isn't the technology, right? It's all about mindset and culture and the status quo. Everyone around has changed, and then it's like, okay, we have to do this. And it's like, you know, when you tell your story, it's like, you already know what has to happen, but like the challenge is everybody else. It's like the boiling frog problem. Like, you have to wait and say, okay, before we get cooked, maybe we should figure this out. All right, that was my story time. But there was another good question here, maybe for Dips or Alex. So I don't know who asked this, but it's a good question. Like, why do so few companies? Why do you think so few companies are trying to solve for continuous compliance? Why is it like? Why is there no other tools in the space? Why is it not something, like, it's starting to be talked about at the DevOps Enterprise Summit? It's like, it's not really kind of bubbling up yet, but like, we know it's such a big problem.
It's an incredibly hard problem to solve. Because it's not as much about the tech, it's about the mindset, right? You're competing against an establishment which has existing systems, policies, processes, frameworks, everything defined, all in like hundreds of thousands of Excel spreadsheets across the world. That's what you are disrupting here. So it's a hard challenge.
You're picking the wrong fight.
I would also say that practices follow like technology, but it's way behind, right? So you've had this huge technological shift from like these old ways of doing stuff to DevOps, but again, like the practices around that are just kind of running behind. So I think it's just a matter of time.
Yeah, I kind of follow that up as well and saying, if I think back to when I was at a bank, a lot of the changes were point and click changes. You do it on a system. It's a lot of manual effort. So if I can imagine putting Kosli into that kind of system, it's a bit more difficult to think of how you'd actually do that. But now that you've actually got infrastructure as code or code being deployed and different pipelines going through, it's a lot simpler to have an API call out or a command line interface call out to these systems. And then that enables you to have that compliance as code to kind of go through it. And so people have seen there's a gap in the market that we can take advantage of where we're going to. At least that's kind of why I think it might have been a bit more difficult and why you've kind of got in there quite early on.
And I think it's also where you'd see that people think of it as a black and white, where you either have full continuous compliance happening all the time, or you have full manual processes. There can be lots of gray in between, right? And lots of shades of gray. One example that comes to mind is around risk assessment. Now, you have got an ability to identify what the changes are, what are being deployed, but from there, can you calculate what is the commercial risk associated with that change, or the financial risk associated with that change? Because it could be an infrastructure change being deployed, one microservice, something on the mobile app, It's incredibly hard to boil it down to a form where you have got someone like the CFO who's responsible or accountable for assessing and approving a change based on the financial risk. And they're like, well, what is the financial risk of this change? And none of the SHA will tell me that, right? So
it's interesting. I'm kind of curious as well. Like a lot of places we talk, they've got like, they don't have a process like for all they have a process, but if you look at individual teams, they've got very different ways of working. And I think that's a good thing. I mean, you want teams to like build the culture and have a strong ownership. And also what's from a risk perspective is that they have very, very different risks. Like if you're like the PSD2 API for the bank, these days, the regulators are pretty interested if you're up or down, like because it's like, okay, we're past the point where you can't you can half do PSD2 because like again you're playing an important role in the industry. So it's like, okay, but there's other parts of your systems that are in development, are internal tools. They've still got risks associated, but they're different and they have different requirements.
Yeah, I think you're pointing to a very interesting perspective there when it comes to the relevance of tech in the society. Mainframe systems have been running for 50 years, but back in the day, you used to go inside into a back office, process whatever you have to, and there were systems running, but they were not as customer-facing or so, they were important, yes, but not so crucial for the running of a society. Technology is now, without technology, you basically, you will struggle to run a society without the technology. And I also think, we're sort of meeting or bridging the gap, between some of the engineering best practices, I believe, and engaging engineers into thinking in legal terms or compliance terms. These are, the boundaries or the walls, as we have heard before as well, are slowly, being built as well, where the one and the same engineer is solving the business problem, but also the legal problem, but also the compliance problem from the position that the engineer is in. So, I mean, from people were doing Agile or doing DevOps before there were DevOps tools per se, right down from the Jira tickets, from Post-it notes. They were probably not called Jira tickets at the time because we were no Jira system, but we had Post-it notes, how to organize our work. And from Hudson or Jenkins and those type of systems, now we're sort of using the tools that we have and bridging that into the legal aspect and saying, yes, we have this information, we have this data, how can we make it useful in this context?
Isn't that a problem? I mean, this is a question for everyone. I think that I get it. I totally agree with everything you said, but I'm also kind of aware that we're asking an awful lot from developers these days. They should be good at coding. That's the table stakes. But then, yeah, it'd be great if they were really good at TDD as well, because we want their code to actually work. And yeah, we're in a bank, so they also have to be security champions. So they have to go on security training and know how to write secure code and care about their dependencies. And, they should own their pipelines, right? I mean, who else is going to own their pipelines? This is their delivery mechanism, of course. And, and it goes on. And then we say, okay, that's just the technical stuff. Then they've got a domain to deal with. What should this code actually do? Do I need to talk to legal? Am I going to become a whistleblower in a case I don't know about? It's there's from a cognitive load perspective, how is it to be how is it even possible to be a developer in a regulated industry?
Abstractions, I guess, platforms. I know you like those, Mike. Yes.
Ensemble, yeah. I mean, collaboration is definitely one thing, but if you have a look at job adverts these days for developers, people talk about, how the salary expectations are growing, but look at the expectations on the other side of the card as well. It's there is a kind of a...
Yeah. They are the new unicorns, right?
Yeah.
That's the mythical creature, and it's quite rare to find someone with everything. One thing that I've seen work quite well is to see where there is willingness from the developers to pick up additional areas and have an open conversation around which areas they need help with. So for instance, if they can't get around the security side of things, it's about adding someone to the team who can take care of those responsibilities, but over a period of time, get them to understand and grow in that respect, right? Different people always bring different skills and experience, and I don't think it would be fair to expect someone to know everything of everything. Like nobody does that, right? So it's probably, and that's how I have looked at solving it, is by adding to the team to provide those skills in the short term, and then finding champions who can then grow and raise the bar across different areas.
Yeah, so the way we've looked at it, well, the way you're actually seeing it more in the market is you'll see a lot more almost DevX roles for developer experience.
Yeah.
There's more teams spinning up around that, looking at, again, I mentioned it in mine, it's that empowerment thing in terms of, yes, you're piling all these things on, but then it's how does that scale to make sure that then, because alignment isn't always there, or if they're too dug deep in the processes, do they actually understand the why behind what they're building, and then lose actual sight of the product they're going? So actually what you're seeing more and more is a lot more DevX roles coming up, where you have got platform teams which look after the underlying infrastructure, pipelines, etc., to make it easy, but DevX actually looking at how a developer interacts with that, and it's the collaboration between the two is, I think, trying to solve this problem because of the higher and higher demands that we're putting on our developers in a regulated environment.
Yeah. So I think a combination of those two things is exactly what the answer is. Basically creating like the abstractions through platforms and having DevX make sure that the developers understand it, but then also maybe looking at the not looking at individual developers that should know everything, but teams that together know everything that they need to worry about. I think that's basically the answer.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, but I think that's a great note to wrap up on. I think I want to thank everyone for their collaboration tonight. The talks have been excellent. Lamisi, you will give a talk for me one day. But it's been, so thank you all. It's really special to have you come and tell your stories. And I want to thank everyone in the audience that came today. It's great that there's people actually interested in this thing that James and I started all these years ago. It wasn't always that people would come and listen to us talk about this stuff. So it's fun, and I hope we can do it again next year. So let's, if you would all pretend to have a drink of water, that would help us wrap this up. Great.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, guys.